This is a video game. This is the gaming industry. And the gaming industry...
There is no Nintendo CD. Understood?
...is at war. The very same genre that made Nintendo a household word had allowed Sega to topple the empire. The genre that had dominated console gaming for nearly 10 years. The 2D platformer. Many a third-party developer would try their hand at building an attitudinal animal mascot of their very own. But one company was conspicuous by its absence. Rare. Rare was co-founded in 1985 by the Stamper brothers, Tim and Chris. The UK studio had achieved a fair bit of notoriety, cranking out more than 40 titles for the NES. But when the 16-bit wars began, Rare largely stayed on the sidelines. Aside from a couple of Battletoads games, including a crossover as bizarre as it was awesome, the company had yet to make a mark in the 16-bit era. Their absence was no accident. While other companies were rushing out with ill-conceived concepts, the Stampers decided to take a different risk. They invested their NES profits into obscenely expensive Silicon Graphics workstations, the bleeding edge of 3D capability. The stations were intended primarily for film effects, but the Stampers wanted to see what they could do for gaming. They developed a method to animate polygonal models on Silicon Graphics and transfer these animations to a format the Super Nintendo could display. Pushing a game console way past what it was supposed to be able to do would become one of the signature hallmarks of the company, and it began here. Rare showed off its work to Nintendo, who swiftly scooped up 49% of the company. The newly minted Rareware was suddenly one of the most technologically advanced developers in the world, and with Nintendo backing them, it was time to create a game that would make them famous. So this is a video game. Video games look like this, feel like this, and then one day, you see this. And this is not on Sega's fancy new 32X. This isn't on a CD-ROM. Heck, this ain't even next gen. This is Donkey Kong Country. So why did Rare and Nintendo decide to bring back Donkey Kong? The character debuted as an antagonist in 1981, and at least at first, he was the star. The game was even named after him, while the player character was a bit of an afterthought. The point that his name merely described what he did when you hit the button. But while Jumpman would evolve far beyond these roots and end up as the icon of the entire industry, DK was left in this primordial state. Aside from a few cameos and remakes, Donkey Kong hadn't appeared in over a decade. But that's exactly why DK was such a perfect fit for this project. He was famous enough to be recognized, yet outdated enough to be reinvented. So the Stampers took this long period of absence to heart, and did something really unusual in gaming, even today. They aged up the characters. Donkey Kong had gotten old, he'd gone gray, he'd become cranky, and he'd passed his name on to his son. DK Jr. lost the singlet, put on a tie, and became the modern-day Donkey Kong. Or maybe DK Jr. had a son and it's this guy, it's kind of ambiguous. The setting was moved from bright red construction girders to a place far better suited to showing off those Silicon graphics. Donkey Kong Island. And where your father's Donkey Kong was a barrel-throwing, lady-swapping bad guy, Rare's Donkey Kong was laid back and peaceful, if a bit hedonistic. DK wants nothing more than to relax on his island and hoard bananas. And so the game begins, and DK busts out of his treehouse. Now the genre's conventions meant that you needed to move right, but directly behind you, an open cave. Now let's say you were like every other kid I knew, and you skipped right over the instruction manual. Going in the cave would convey a hint of the story. DK's peaceful demeanor would be challenged when King K. Rool and his Kremling crew stole his banana hoard on a dark and stormy night. And by the way, if you did skip the instructions, you really missed out. I love the way Cranky breaks the fourth wall throughout, insulting the game, the player, and the very concept of notes pages. While I have no idea what a bunch of reptiles want with mountains of bananas, it's awesome how that forms the crux of the game. Most other game heroes were out to save princesses, conquer empires, save the world. But DK, he was a man of the 90s, and he just wanted his stuff back. Back outside the cave, you might hop up to the treehouse. If you go inside, you'll score an extra life. Now both the cave and the treehouse are pretty obviously meant to teach the player something. This game is going to have hidden secrets. Keep your eyes open and explore, and you will be rewarded. The treehouse even plays the bonus stage theme. A few paces up is the game's first enemy, a naughty. Now maybe you walk right into it. That's it. There's no life bar, no hit points, nothing to keep you safe. To showcase the game's graphical fidelity, the decision was made early on to keep the screen free from clutter. Instead of a litany of counters and HUD elements, collectibles would only scroll on screen when they were relevant and slip off to let the player stay immersed. That might sound simple, but this decision had an impeccable influence on every element of the game design, because when you get past that naughty, you find a DK barrel. Mega Man had a health bar, Mario had his power-ups, and Sonic could take hits forever as long as he could hold onto a ring. Instead of anything like that, Donkey Kong would have a partner, Diddy Kong. Thanks to this tag team dynamic, you didn't feel alone in this world, and that too was intentional. Getting back the Banana Horde was a community effort, headed up by an extended Kong family. A pastiche of early 90s surfer culture named Funky Kong can give you quick access to earlier worlds. Cranky Kong spouts off hilariously self-aware dialogue and gives you hints. And instead of saving from a menu, you, what? This is Candy Kong and this is her save point. Okay, I mean, plus 10 for not being a damsel in distress, but minus several million for being a 40s pinup mixed with a gorilla. Yeah, I don't know, even when I was a kid, she always just creeped me out. Yeah, she can kiss my donkey. Get it? Because a donkey is also called an ass, you see, and, okay. The barrels themselves are the one holdover from DK's arcade roots, and the game's focus on throwing them, blasting out of them, and using them to find bonus rooms is one of the things that sets DKC apart from most other platformers. By this point in the level, the music is picked up, that distinctive DK Island swing. As amazing as the game looked, the way it sounded would be just as important in giving it its identity. I remember magazines that claimed it sounded so good, you'd swear there was a CD inside the cartridge. It wasn't what people thought of as video game music. Evelyn Fisher, Robin Beanland, and David Wise's soundtrack was more cinematic and thoughtful, and would often incorporate environmental sounds into some incredibly memorable medleys. But while all the praise the soundtrack gets is very well deserved, the sound effects tend to get overlooked. Jungle Hijinks has 4 distinct enemy types, and wouldn't you know it, each one makes a different noise. You can hear a DK barrel from off-screen before you reach it, and late in the game when you're tense and nervous and frustrated, just hearing that sound is a godsend. There's a real sense of place in this game. It has a sophistication that was often lacking in games at the time. I mean, these are still cartoon apes fighting anthropomorphic reptiles, sure, but it was mature not in its themes, but in its tone. Some stages are huge and bombastic, but others are melancholy or thoughtful, and at least a few are downright chilling. Through all these elements, Donkey Kong Country was able to achieve an atmosphere that no video game had ever matched. About halfway through the first stage, you'll come across a crate. Busting it open reveals an animal buddy, Rambi the Rhino. And this guy is freaking strong. Everything about him extenuates that. He powers through a line of naughties. He makes this distinct, powerful galloping sound. He's basically invincible from the front. If it can die, it will die. Animal buddies are another big part of what'll give this series its identity. They're level specific, allowing the developers to theme some stages around them. When they get hit, they'll go running off, and you might be able to chase them down again. Animal buddies help to keep the gameplay fresh, and their designs are not only appealing, they immediately inform what they can do. Espresso's skinny legs can't hurt enemies, but he can float through the air. On Guard is easier to control underwater, and his nose is just as effective as Rambi's horn. Right here he also occasionally shows up as a hologram. Spox holds a light for you in one level, back in the days before sudden flashing lights were considered a problem. And finally, Winky is a frog and is absolutely perfect in every way. Finding any of these guys was always exciting, and just like the Kong family lent a hand, they too showcase a deliberate design. Instead of adding power-ups or menu options or hit points, Rare instead added distinct characters, and it gives the game so much more vibrancy as an interconnected world. As for Rambi, he can also bust through hidden entrances, and in Jungle Hijinks, a new player is almost certain to slip down here, break the wall, and end up in the first proper bonus room. When you come back to the level, you burst out the other side, hop down to the only platform you can see, and discover that items can be hidden underground. Maybe that clues you into another bonus room, and starts to reinforce the idea that a barrel often indicates a nearby secret. As you reach the end of the stage, a storm starts to roll in, darkening the entire scene and highlighting just how gorgeous this world looks and how fluent the graphic designers had already become. You can even turn around and head back through the level like this. Now maybe you're thinking to yourself, okay, so the graphics were pretty, but aside from presentation, this really wasn't anything new. Plenty of other platformers had you throwing things, plenty of them had hidden secrets. The two-character dynamic instantly reminded me of Tails, and the animal buddies were blatantly variations on Yoshi. Even in 1994, DKC was often compared to Super Mario World. But while that might have a similar structure to a Mario game, I'll argue that the comparison was faulty, because Donkey Kong Country did not play like Mario. Tapping the Y button lets the Kongs roll or cartwheel through enemies, and every time you hit one, you move a little faster. That momentum would even be preserved if you went over a ledge or jumped. You can also roll off ledges and jump in midair to clear more distance or reach higher areas. The lead designer, Greg Mayles, said years later, Super Mario World was sublime and intricate, best appreciated at a slower speed. Whereas Donkey Kong Country was extravagant and brash. You can take your time through this game, taking in the atmosphere and looking for secrets. In fact, I would encourage you to. But once you have, once the graphics have lost their spectacle and you know where everything is, here's the kicker. Every obstacle, every enemy, every vine and platform and blast barrel is placed in such a way that if you're skilled, you can move through the game with a speed and grace worthy of the aesthetic. DK and Diddy didn't change attributes or gain powers, and so the focus could be not on merely overcoming obstacles, but on skill mastery. Now that sounds familiar. Isn't there some other series that focus on building your skill to speed ever more impressively through painstakingly designed levels? Maybe one I spent all summer talking about? Yeah, there it is. Donkey Kong Country controlled like Mario and had the same sort of linear, focused level design, but I argue that it could be played a whole lot more like Sonic. It certainly felt unlike anything that had come before. It was more technical than Mario, more deliberate than Sonic, and way less forgiving than either of them. Playing Donkey Kong Country to perfection is akin to the rhythm of a musical instrument. Over the next generation, a big part of Rare's MO would be to take Nintendo's revolutionary concepts and do them bigger, faster, and stronger too. This is where that lineage began, by blending the crunchy precision of Mario's design, the kinetic flow of Sonic's, and an unprecedented style. DKC aimed to be the creme de la creme of action platformers. But as fun as it was, and as outstanding as it looked, DKC wasn't perfect. Yep, animal tokens. Collect 3 of them, and you'll be yanked into a bonus stage to earn lives. The problem is, they completely and often unexpectedly interrupt the gameplay that's supposed to be the focus of this design. Cranky claims they aren't even in the game, and I wish he was right. I always just try to avoid them. Speaking of which, the bonus stages themselves are kinda undercooked. Most of them are hidden pretty cleverly, but a few are just way too unintuitive. I mean, here's one that's entirely reliant on a leap of faith, and this is in the second level. Most of them are better than that, but they still lack variety. Match items, grab bananas, jump correctly, it just gets repetitive. Worse yet, aside from a slightly different ending, there's no new content for finding all the bonus levels. Cranky's hints only cover World 1 for some reason, no matter where you are in the game. And the only really good boss was King K. Rool himself. The others were just kinda simplistic, and most of them were even recolors. As you get deeper into Donkey Kong Country, the levels themselves become less varied. Every world in the game introduces at least one new archetype, except for the final one, Chimp Caverns. And there's another problem. DKC has only 4 of the iconic jungle stages that are so overtly associated with the series. There are 2 treetop stages, 4 water stages, only 1 of these stunningly beautiful ice stages. But there are, no joke, 10 stages that take place in a dimly lit cave or mine. And I mean, I love the tough minecart stages, but coming to yet another cave starts to feel like a chore. All of this is a consequence of a pretty short development time, combined with a ton of pressure. DKC was rough around the edges and even unfair in places. It's a fun game, but it's certainly a flawed one. A ton of style, but not enough substance. Ultimately, I suppose, it's proof that players will put up with mediocre gameplay as long as the art's good. Nah, I'm kidding. Shigeru Miyamoto, if you somehow don't know, is the creator of Mario and Donkey Kong and a ton of other iconic Nintendo franchises. For a long time, it was kind of an urban legend that he'd said that about Donkey Kong Country. I can't find an original source, and it's almost certainly not true. Miyamoto was in fact regularly consulted during the game's development. Nonetheless, DKC would face a lot of backlash as the years went on, and that quote is emblematic of that backlash. All due respect to Shiggy, but if he ever said that, he was wrong. Donkey Kong Country had some issues, sure. What were amazing visuals in 1994 look like dithered plastic nowadays. But what Donkey Kong Country proved was that the coming leap in graphical fidelity would allow for not just different, but more immersive gaming experiences than what had come before. It showed us a glimpse into the future of the medium, and just as importantly, it didn't abandon what made gaming so great in the first place. DKC did for gaming what Toy Story did for animated movies, and it happened a year earlier. What it certainly was mediocre. If the gameplay was that secondary to the graphics, DKC would be about as well remembered today as Myst. Was it derivative? Who cares? What game isn't derivative? It still set a new standard for the industry. It still had a crew of memorable characters, and thanks to its kinetic, crunchy, fast-paced gameplay, it still stands the test of time. But back in 1994, Donkey Kong Country was an instant success. Retailers couldn't keep it in stock over the holidays, and the game would go on to sell over 9 million copies. The King of the Jungle was back, and for the first time in years, Nintendo wasn't just competing with Sega, Nintendo was winning. Donkey Kong Country was more than a hit, it was a phenomenon. And by 1995, it was on like, well, you know. For perhaps the only time in the history of Nintendo, Mario took a step back, at least in the West. Now don't get me wrong, he was always Nintendo's mascot, but for the 2 years between DKC's release and the Nintendo 64, you'd be forgiven for doubting that. When I went to AOL keyword Nintendo, it wasn't Mario who greeted me. And look at this, a Super Nintendo bundle that included 4 classic Mario titles, but it was the 5th game that took top billing. Given what a sensation they had here, it would have been almost simple for Rare to make a sequel. Let those famous graphics work their magic, put in some new characters and mechanics, and patch over DKC's holes. It's a tried and true approach. It's how most series do things, and there's nothing wrong with it. It works. Even putting the graphics aside, DKC was an extremely good game. A sequel that followed the formula could have been great, but Rare was no longer content to create a product that was merely great. Instead, they made Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest. It's been a year since DK and Diddy chased the Kremlings off of Donkey Kong Island and took back the Banana Horde. But K. Rool has been licking his wounds, and he's got a new plan. He catches Donkey Kong sleeping and leaves behind a ransom note. If you yellow-bellied, land-loving Kongs want DK back, you'll have to hand over the Banana Horde. Yeah, the Kremlings are pirates now. When the Kongs discover this plot, Cranky wants to acquiesce. Not that he's past his prime, he just want to be caught dead in a game with bonus levels and in-bosses. Hey, you're leaning on the fourth wall a little hard there, Cranky. Might take you a decade or two, but you'll come around. But the point stands. Without Donkey Kong, there really isn't anyone with the credibility to take down K. Rool. Except, Diddy knows that DK would hate to lose his horde again. And more than that, this could be a chance to prove himself. Diddy was a sidekick last time, and also ran, dare I say, a wannabe. But if he could save Donkey Kong and thwart K. Rool's scheme, he'd be a hero in his own right. On the surface, this seems like a pretty typical excuse plot for a video game. The villains kidnap someone, the main character has to rescue him. But remember, Donkey Kong was the face of the first game, and one of the most famous names in the industry. Diddy, on the other hand, was Rare's creation, and his story mirrors theirs. Rare needed to prove that they weren't a one-hit wonder. Eschewing DK's star power wasn't just risky, it was subversive. Speaking of which, Diddy won't be alone. Dixie Kong makes her debut and becomes the second playable character. In the first game, Diddy might have been the designated second banana, but he was also the flat-out better character in all but a handful of situations. He was more nimble than DK, he held barrels as a shield, he ran a lot faster. There's rarely a time when I don't prefer him. From a gameplay perspective, Dixie inherits a lot of Donkey Kong's attributes. She's not as quick as Diddy, and she carries barrels overhead with her ponytail. How are you doing that? The level design and enemy placement allows for a lot more situations where this overhead style comes in handy. But of course, most famously, Dixie has got that helicopter-y hair thing. This controllable glide makes things so much easier. There are plenty of places only she can go, and plenty of shortcuts only she can take. But don't think this makes her partner superfluous. This is distinctly Diddy's game, and his kinetic, frantic speed is at the center of this design, much more so than the other games in the trilogy. Having that second character feels even less like a free hit. Diddy and Dixie also have a team throw that can be used to reach hidden areas and take down some tough enemies. The two playable characters each have their own strengths. They each have scores of situations where one might be preferable, and they complement each other incredibly well. I mean, they should. They are dating. I forgot to mention that. After Candy Kong was so, exaggerated, you might not have expected Rare to pull this off. But Dixie is awesome. I mean, to this day, she's my favorite heroine in gaming, and Rare knew exactly what they were doing. That she's Diddy's girlfriend, that she's a girl at all, is an attribute. It's secondary to her character, and that's the kind of thing that still might be pretty subversive. Determined, insistent, and maybe a little more scared than they're letting on, the pair set out to rescue their big buddy, but it won't be easy. Donkey and Diddy had the home field advantage in DKC, but K. Rool's retreated to the Kremling homeland, Crocodile Isle. The uneasy, unfamiliar sense of infringing on enemy territory permeates throughout, and combined with the pirate motif, it gives DKC2 an edge that the first game didn't have. It's generally darker, yes, you hear that all the time, but I don't feel like that conveys how imaginative Crocodile Isle is. The Kremlings are a bizarre bunch, and their island reflects that. Pirate ships, castle fortresses, crystal mines, and these gorgeous roller coasters with fireworks illuminating the mountains. I have a thing for video game carnivals, don't I? The point is, Rare pulled off something really impressive. By implementing such a menacing theme, they could use more interesting and fanciful stage tropes without mitigating the sense of atmosphere that was so important to the first game. The level design itself also became more varied. DKC was all about moving left to right. In Diddy's Conquest, you run left to right in the first level. Classic, simple and clean. But in the second stage, you're climbing a massive rigging structure, vertical stage design that gives Dixie a chance to shine. The third stage throws in water, and now you're zigzagging through the depths of the ship. It's tense and claustrophobic and complex. This variety carries through the whole game, and every level is so well defined. Even individual stage gimmicks tend to be a lot better designed, giving stages distinction without taking away from the core gameplay. The Kremlings have never been so many. Clobbers pop out of seemingly innocuous barrels. Cutlass makes you parry his sword. Clingers harry your ascent, and zingers are absolutely terrifying. Seriously, just hearing that low droning buzz still sends chills through me. Diddy's Conquest strikes an impressive balance. Compared to its predecessor, it's more fair and yet far more challenging. But hey, the Kongs still have plenty of help. Rambi and Ingard return, and both of them can now charge forward, breaking through hidden walls and piercing enemy defenses. Glimmer takes over lighting duties, and Clapper similarly shows up as a gimmick to cool off lava and freeze over water. Espresso and his weird hitboxes are gone, and in his place, Squawks can properly take to the skies. Winky, sadly, appears only in the back of the Monkey Museum and is replaced by Rattly. Winky's design might not have worked well with a Super Chump, and I suppose Rattly's coil is a lot more visually precise. But Squitter more than makes up for losing Winky. He's the only spider I've ever liked, and he's so much fun. He can't jump on enemies, so he fires webs to take him down instead. And he can deploy web platforms that make his stages feel completely different from the others. Animal Buddies in DKC were a lot of fun, but they had some setbacks. They stuck a little too close to Yoshi's formula. You could lose them, and that meant that the levels couldn't be crafted with the guarantee that they would be there. Early on in DKC2, when you're still getting your bearings, they operate in much the same way, but then you find one of these, animal barrels. Hop in, and instead of just riding an animal, Diddy and Dixie will transform. In a game that doesn't focus on traditional power-ups, this makes so much more sense than the Yoshi approach. Combined with signposts that revert the Kongs back to normal, Rare could now theme challenges, bonus rooms, or even entire stages around the unique attributes the Animal Buddies bring. They're a much stronger aspect of the design this time around. And speaking of which, let's talk collectibles. The extended Kong family makes the trek to Crocodile Isle with you, but they want to be compensated for their time. Banana coins let you pay them for their services. Swinky runs a trivia game where you can earn lives. Candy's save point is hilariously replaced by Cranky's wife, a sweet old grandmother type named Wrinkly. Funky is still a dude! And Cranky provides his signature humor, gives you clues to where bonus stages are, and best of all, his hints extend past World 1 this time. In the first game, bonus stages were just that, a bonus. Secret areas where you got some extra stuff. But now, not only are they hidden more cleverly, they're achievements unto themselves. You'll need to overcome specific challenges. Navigate to the end, destroy all the enemies, collect all the stars. This is so much more interesting than just running through a cave and getting some bananas. Every time you pass one, you'll get a Krem coin. And thanks to that, there's actually a real purpose to bonus rooms, because for every 15 Krem coins, you'll be able to bribe a Kremling turncoat named Klubba to gain access to the Lost World. It contains some of the toughest stages in the game and leads to the true ending. The location of the bonus stages are always hinted at. The camera, the banana trail, something will clue you in. But that's not always the case when it comes to the video game hero coins. There's one in every stage, placed by Cranky to test just how serious Diddy is about making a name for himself. And this being Cranky, they tend to be in the douchiest, most non-intuitive places imaginable. It's very oblique, and I love them. I mean, if hero coins factored more into the end goal of the game, I might criticize them as a fairly transparent attempt to sell more strategy guides. And honestly, they probably were that to an extent, but they're also a reward for the truly dedicated players, who want to ensure that Diddy is a better character than whoever this guy is. And if the levels themselves were going to be so much more varied, the soundtrack would have to follow suit. David Wise returns to provide the score, and I love this man. He absolutely outdoes himself. Cinematic soundtracks in movies or TV shows are usually meant to evoke or enliven a mood. Video game music, on the other hand, was much more concerned with providing a strong, sharp melody to highlight the action, especially back then. But David Wise expertly integrates the best of both styles, and it is absolute genius. There's plenty I haven't even talked about here. The bosses are so much more complex and fun. The graphics are a huge step up, and I still think they look good. I love the way the in-level and death music changes depending on the stage. The animation that plays when you stand still in a team-up. The way you can see DK Island in the map background. I love Bramble Scramble. Bramble Scramble is a stage that comes about halfway through the quest. It's the point where the developers stop screwing around. It's one of the longest, toughest, most frustrating stages in the entire game. The slightest wrong move will kill you. But the music evokes something totally different. It starts out slow and serene. It helps you stay calm and focused while you're building the skills you'll need to make it out of here. And eventually, it all builds to a dramatic crescendo that perfectly encapsulates how it feels to overcome such a seemingly impossible challenge. This music should be such a contrast, yet it's a perfect fit. Yeah, that's a fitting metaphor. You never would have found yourself making your way through a honey-filled beehive on the back of a giant googly-eyed spider in the first game. DKC was so concerned with maintaining a sense of realism, but in DKC2, this is all natural. Yeah, why wouldn't this be here? Things as innocuous as magical rising water, as disruptive as animal transformation barrels, and as awesome as Dixie spawning a guitar. The biggest reason Diddy's Conquest is so much stronger than DKC is because it's so much more of a video game. Now, this is the point in the video where I apply some subjectivity and lay out the game's flaws. But you know what? I can't do that here. Any point I could raise would be picking at the tiniest of nits. I have no critique. And I'll admit, that might be the nostalgia talking. I'd been playing video games for over a year by this point, but truth be told, I wasn't much of a gamer. I was young, and I would just use cheat codes or a Game Genie to get through them instead of actually getting good. But this game was brand new, there were no cheats like that, so I had to actually play it. It took my friends and I more than 6 months to get to K. Rool. We'd be stuck on a single stage for weeks. There'd be parts I was better at, parts they were better at. To this day, my Super NES controllers creak because of this game. It was a frustrating, monumental struggle the whole way through, but it made the victories so much sweeter. This was Diddy's Conquest, but it was mine too, and when I finally knocked K. Rool into the Kremling Force Power and sank Crocodile Isle, it was honestly one of the most fulfilling moments of my life to that point, because for the first time ever, I had earned the right to win. Every year since then, I've played through it at least once. It's an evergreen game for me, and it never loses its shine. Sonic the Hedgehog was the reason I wanted to be a gamer, but until I played this, I was just that, a wannabe. It would have been so easy to just build on DKC's very solid core mechanics, but Rare went so much further beyond. This actually is the creme de la creme of action platformers. It's as close as anything's ever come to being that mythical perfect game, and it's the first thing that comes to mind when I hear that phrase. Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest, is one of the most remarkable video games ever made, and Rare was just getting started. Donkey Kong Country is such a wonderful series. It pushed the boundaries of what the Super Nintendo was capable of. I mean, Donkey Kong Country 2 is considered one of the best platformers on the system, and that is still selling it short. That a follow-up to that game, heck, that any game in this series could turn out so... I do not want to do this. But I will, so let's step back. It was the summer of 1996. DKC was still one of Nintendo's most prominent franchises, but a whole new dimension was just over the horizon, and it wasn't Donkey Kong leading the charge. But my fandom, on the other hand, was at an all-time high. I'd finally beaten Diddy's Conquest, and I'd made quick work of the original after I got it for my birthday. I wanted more. I needed more. So I took a ride on the information superhighway, scouring the news archives at AOL keyword Nintendo, when an idea occurred to me. I typed in a game that I had never heard of, Donkey Kong Country 3. This was the first time I ever learned about an upcoming game release on the internet. As if by magic, this press release granted my every wish. It was called Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. Dixie is getting her own game, that is awesome! And a brand new character would be her partner, Kiddy Kong. You might notice there's no footage here. See, these were the very early days of the internet, and while I learned the name Kiddy Kong, we didn't really have many pictures back then. I wouldn't actually see Kiddy until this issue of Nintendo Power came out a few months later. Yeah, is that a baby baboon wearing lipstick? Huh. Rare was always really good at taking Nintendo's concepts and doing them one better. But, Rare, that only works if you take the good ideas. But oh well, it's alright. Kiddy might be a little weird, but still, a new DKC is coming. And best of all, it'll be starring Dixie Kong.
Donkey Kong Country 3 starring Kiddy Kong.
What? Oh, no it isn't!
Starring Kiddy Kong.
Yeah. So I guess some marketing exec must have decided that a game starring a girl might not sell to boys. But you know what? I was a boy in 1996, and this commercial just kind of offended me. It made me even more antagonistic toward Kiddy. I mean, the game is literally called Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, but no, can't let people know that. We'd better claim the leading role is going to the freaking baby. In the 90s, babies were more suitable game heroes than women. But whatever, commercials are dumb. I was still looking forward to it. After an agonizing wait, November 22nd arrived, and so we could at last bear witness to Rare's 16-bit swan song. This is Donkey Kong Country 3. It's been a few months since Diddy and Dixie committed horrific genocide on the crippling race. And the Kongs are still celebrating. One morning, Dixie wakes up to find a note from Diddy. He and DK are gonna spend the day exploring a serene area to the north of DK Island, the Northern Cremisphere. Days pass, and when the duo fail to return, Dixie sets out to find them. She comes across Wrinkly Kong's cave. Wrinkly might have retired from teaching, but she'll still save your game. Dixie heads over to Funky's Rentals and... Hey, look at that! Funky is no longer a pastiche of 90s surfer culture. He's a mechanic now, but don't you worry, he's still a dude! Then Funky forces Dixie to partner up with Kiddy Kong, and I accidentally turn the game off. Okay, I'm joshing ya. Funky lets Dixie rent a motorboat, leading to one of the biggest additions to this game. In DKC 1 and 2, the world map was always point A to point B, and while individual worlds are still mostly linear, the overworld map is expansive and open. As you play, you'll gain items that Funky can use to build better transport, allowing you more and more freedom. It's a neat design, and there are even some places where you can choose between multiple worlds. This is a great fit for the series, and one of the best additions. As you go through the game, you'll often trade with the Brothers Bear, a multi-spectral cavalcade of humorous personalities. They usually lead you in pursuit of another new feature, Banana Birds. Banana Birds are hidden in caves all over the map. Play a quick Simon Says style minigame, and one of these mythical creatures will break out and go off to flitter around Wrinkly's save cave. And thanks to Blunder Bear dropping some hints, you'll locate a new lost world, Krematoa, where you'll once again trade bonus coins for level progression. Swanky Kong has set up a carnival sideshow, and Dixie and Kiddy are his marks. Cranky plays the dastardly heel, and you'll compete against him in a target minigame to earn rewards. I like the idea, but I can't help but wish Cranky had retained his role from DKC 2. Without him, there are no hints to bonus stage locations or secrets, and given this game's change in focus, that's really something they shouldn't have omitted. That just leaves our playable characters. The Dixie and Kiddy team features the greatest differentiation of the trilogy. The team throw makes a return. When Kiddy throws Dixie, it works like it did in DKC 2, allowing access to higher areas and secrets. But when Dixie throws Kiddy, he slams down, breaking through weak floors. She can also throw him into a wall and then run on top of him, but there are exactly 0 areas where this is actually useful. Kiddy's in-game sprites turn out a lot better than some of his renders, but the biggest problem with him is how severely outclassed he is by Dixie. I often stick him in the lead just so he can soak up a hit. The level design here is not often focused on forward momentum, and it's not worth giving up Dixie's helicopter twirl for a very slight speed boost. Kiddy does skip over water. Okay, that's kinda cool. But his advantages are so weirdly situational. As you've probably gathered, I never really liked Kitty. I always wished they'd just let DK partner up with Dixie. And speaking of DK, in Donkey Kong Country, the first level was a dense jungle, and a rhythmic drumbeat slowly emerged from the environment, building to a frantic medley. In DKC2, you started out with the creaking of a ship, the sound of wind and waves, giving way to a sea shanty that really shaped the outset of this quest. So how does Donkey Kong Country 3 begin? Oh boy! DKC3 tends toward realistic level themes, but with a much more cartoony aesthetic than its predecessors. There's no question that this looks fantastic, and after the previous game was so dark and treacherous, it makes a lot of sense to go the other direction. These brighter vistas do justice to Rare's ACM graphics, and they're clearly pushing the Super NES to its absolute limit. Unfortunately, I mean that literally, there's a lot of slowdown this time around. Dixie discovers that the Kremlings are back, and eventually tracks down their apparent leader, Chaos. He's a giant floating automaton with a SWAT bot head that looks like he was cobbled together out of spare parts. And as it turns out, he actually was. K. Rool was, of course, behind the curtain the whole time. He's adapted the guise of Baron K. Roolenstein and become something of a mad scientist, capturing DK and Diddy and using their brainpower to operate chaos. This story is evidence of two of the biggest problems with DKC3, theme and tone. Now certainly these environments and enemies are creatively designed, but there's not much that thematically ties them together. How cool would it have been if the Kremlings had been horrifying abominations of science, evidence of K. Rool's experiments gone awry? I mean sure, have everything start out all bright and happy, but as you get deeper into the game, something's going horribly wrong here. Donkey Kong Island's two biggest heroes are gone, but it's played so lightly here that what should be a tremendous undertaking has all the apprehension of a Saturday morning cartoon. Now there's nothing wrong with comic relief villains or a lighthearted approach, but DKC2 made me feel things. DKC3 lacks that kind of pathos. At the end of the first two games, Cranky gives the heroes his begrudging respect, a respect that's felt by the player as well. But Dixie and Kitty don't even get that. Speaking of Cranky, his video game hero coins are back, and are now more properly christened DK coins. While before the challenge was where they were, now it's more often how to get them. Each one is guarded by a Kremling who is named, of course, Coin. Haha. He's using the DK coin as a shield, so you'll need to find a way to bounce a steel keg into him from behind. It's a pretty well done mechanic, and you'll even get that aha feeling from some of the more challenging puzzles. Once you get all the DK coins, Funky will craft the gyrocopter, which opens the overworld up completely and lets you nab the last few banana birds. When you get all of them, they take you to meet the Queen Banana Bird, who sticks it to K. Rool one last time. DKC2 ended with Crocodile Isle sinking against a gorgeous sunrise. This game ends with a giant egg falling on K. Rool. Well, at least it fits. On a more positive note though, this does do a lot to expand the mythology of the series. If bananas in the Rare Island chain are derived from banana birds, they might be packed with a magical energy. That in turn could explain what exactly a bunch of reptiles wanted with DK's banana horde in the first place. It's just that you have to actually play the game to experience any of that, and while the world is impressively cohesive, the gameplay is not. Donkey Kong Country to this point was a very sharp experience. Stages were built with an amazing sense of rhythm, allowing a skilled player to blast through with a dynamic finesse that was honestly unparalleled. Donkey Kong Country 3 is not designed this way. It's a lot slower paced and nowhere near as kinetic. It's not uncommon to have to backtrack a bit, or wait for platforms, or solve puzzles with endlessly respawning barrels. The game sacrifices that quick pace for level variety. Almost every stage introduces something that sets it apart from the others. Now, DKC stages had always had gimmicks, but they generally supported the rhythmic core gameplay. But in this game, the gimmicks obfuscate the gameplay. They're so often the focus that they just become tedious. Monkeys throw nuts at you, and you'll have to hide behind barrel shields. There's a stage where enemies fire at you from the background, and one where the same thing happens from the foreground. A hungry fish will take a bite out of you if you don't keep him full. Then there's this freaking stage, Squeals on Wheels, where you have to defeat enemies to open doors. Thrilling. For every cool concept like Low-G Labyrinth, there are a dozen stages where the gimmick just wears on you. In the first two games, stages that I didn't really like were the exception, but here, they're the rule. The slower pace even extends to the new animal buddies. I mean, Rambi was a powerhouse, all about forward momentum, near invulnerable from the front, obliterating Kremlings like a tank on ecstasy. But he's not even in this game. In his place, Ellie the elephant can use her trunk to pull barrels in from afar, drop them on enemies, and suck up water to snipe Kremlings. She is also terrified of squeals. Perry the parallel bird is hilarious. He flies directly overhead, taking out certain airborne enemies, picking up items, and turning into glorious prizes should you manage to keep him until the end. It's a real oversight that he's never gotten his own game. Anyway, is Donkey Kong Country 3 innovative? Absolutely. Is it well designed? Yeah, for the most part. But is it anywhere near as fun as the first two games? I don't think so. The sad thing is, it could have been every bit as legendary as they were, and it still would have been destined to be forgotten. Rare knew it too. Rare's veteran team had created the first two games, their A-team, with guys like Chris Sutherland and Greg Mayles, but that team didn't work on DKC3. And while Nintendo claimed this decision was meant to keep the series fresh, the real reason is patently obvious. I mean, look, Wrinkly's playing it right now. Rare's most experienced people were now working on games for the Nintendo 64. That was the future. So Part 3 fell to the B-team, and it shows. Evelyn Fisher did the soundtrack, and don't get me wrong, this music is great, but a Donkey Kong Country without David Wise just doesn't quite feel right. Even the instruction manual is much more typical. There's no quips from Cranky bashing the game. It just lacks that trademark Rare sense of humor that Lee Loveday would have brought. The point is, from music to gameplay to characters, down to even the instructions, there's almost nothing about this game that's anywhere near as strong or solid or groundbreaking as it was before. I said I didn't want to do this, but I didn't mean that I didn't want to critique it. I meant that I didn't want to play it. Most of it just feels like a chore. I mean, literally, look, I'm this far into the script, and I still haven't even gotten close to the end of the game. That's never happened before. I would rather work than keep playing. I complete DKC 1 and 2 at least once a year, and I always have. But what you've seen here is my first time playing through Country 3 since it was released on the Wii Shop channel over 7 years ago. And where I played 1 and 2 to completion when I was a kid, it has taken me 19 years to finish DKC 3's Lost World and free the Queen Banana Bird. This is the first time I've ever done it. But you know, a funny thing happened as I got close to the end. The game got a lot more challenging, sure, but it also got a lot more fun. I could feel this less seasoned team working out the kinks, starting to pull off stage variety and crunchy gameplay with so much more cohesion. In spite of all I've said, I do not think that this is a bad game. When I look at it objectively, Donkey Kong Country 3 is at the very worst an above-average 16-bit platformer. It took the series in a bold new direction, and why wouldn't it? You weren't going to improve on DKC2's formula, so it only made sense to try something different. I wouldn't have wanted it to be a rehash. One of the amazing things about the Donkey Kong Country series even now is how well each individual game sets itself apart from the others. It's just that bold new direction so sharply turned away from the kinetic gameplay that I loved about the series. But that's my problem. If you lean more toward the puzzle solving or exploration or world building elements of video games, I expect you'll find a much better game than I did. Experience is the greatest inhibitor of creativity and innovation. This team did not yet know what not to do, but there's a lot of charm to the Northern Hemisphere and all its vibrancy, and all this unbridled design. It might not have revolutionized graphical fidelity, and it might not be a near-perfect epic, but there's no doubt that Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, was made with passion. And it's a good thing it was, because Donkey Kong Country would not return for 14 years. Welcome to the fourth in a series of videos looking at the modern incarnation of Donkey Kong. Over the next few weeks, I'll be doing a series of shorter episodes that will cover the many titles which fall outside of the mainline Donkey Kong Country pentalogy. I shall call it DK, the DK Wrap-Up. It's a really clever pun, trust me. First, let's talk about the scope of this retrospective. Beginning with his appearance in Mario Kart 64, and continuing unabated to this day, the majority of the Donkey Kong canon is in fact made up of Mario sports titles. And you know, that's fine. I'm glad he's important enough to be there. A lot of these are excellent games in their own right, and somehow, just as many are Mario parties. However, this series would carry on for years if I tried to talk about all of them. Therefore, I just won't be covering this cavalcade of cameo games. Other than that, the only rule is that a member of the Kong family must be playable. Let's get started. Throughout the original Super Nintendo trilogy, there was a pattern. We could look forward to a new Donkey Kong Country game each November. Then, sometime the next year, it would be followed by a portable companion on the Game Boy. These made a handheld trilogy, Donkey Kong Land. Shortly after the events of Donkey Kong Country, Cranky is rambling to its heroes, as he does. After a few hours of resolutions and colors and too many buttons, DK has had enough, and he snaps at his father. His grandfather. his patriarchal figure. People like Donkey Kong Country for more than just the fancy graphics, you old coot. Cranky says if that's the case, the game would have been just as successful on a weaker system that couldn't handle such fancy graphics, right? A system like, say, the Game Boy? DK should learn to respect his elders, because this was all part of the plan. DK and Diddy have little choice but to agree when Cranky says he will call K. Rool on the telephone to request that the banana horde be stolen again, just so DK and Diddy can prove themselves. This story is ridiculous, and I love it. It's one of the first times I remember encountering metafiction, but the story is not the only thing that's odd about Donkey Kong Land. For whatever reason, Nintendo's Game Boy games tended to be much more peculiar than their console counterparts, and Donkey Kong Land was no exception, and I do mean that in the best way. It starts out in your standard DK jungle, but the deeper you get, the more whacked out the game becomes. Where Country was atmospheric and realistic, Land could not do that, and it embraced that fact. You'll eventually discover the sunken depths of Kremlantis, pull Kong letters out of the interface to make platforms, and ultimately chase down K. Rool in Big Ape City. The Kongs clambering through a cityscape is such a juxtaposition of the series' usual setting, and that's awesome. What's not so awesome is the gameplay. The story proposes something the game design fails to deliver. The heroes claim that DKC would have been a fun game, even without the graphics. So it's ironic that Donkey Kong Land is handicapped by trying to copy them. I'd have preferred traditional, smaller pixel sprites if they could have kept some of that fluid, fast-paced gameplay intact. That said, I understand why Rare made this decision. Donkey Kong Country would have been a fun game without them, but it was the ACM graphics that made it famous, and bringing that to the Game Boy was invaluable from a marketing perspective. It's just, I don't know, this doesn't even look that good. These assets just weren't meant for a monochromatic, low-resolution display. And you might be saying, well, of course they look bad blown up to this resolution. But oh no, it was much worse at the time. This is about what the game looks like on a Game Boy Color, but that thing didn't come out until 1998. This is more akin to what it looked like on an original Game Boy in '95. Rare made the mistake of featuring dark character sprites on a dark background of the same color, and on the Game Boy's tiny, blurry little screen. It's no wonder I never got past World 2. Well, it's time to fix that. Look at how tiny K. Rool is. Anyway, I did finally finish it. Now, if the opening story was that meta, I can't wait to see the ending. Huh. No, it kinda works. Fortunately, Donkey Kong Land 2 and 3 would fix most of these issues. The engine was refined, the stage design was more solid, and thanks to lighter backgrounds and much better optimized character sprites, you could actually see what you were doing. They even managed to pull off some degree of that kinetic gameplay. 2 and 3 are excellent platformers for the Game Boy, although they don't really deviate from their 16-bit counterparts as much as I would like. The original Donkey Kong Land is certainly the most interesting. It did a lot to expand the series' mythology, but as a game, I can't really recommend it unless you're a hardcore fan. In any case, all 3 games finally came out on the 3DS eShop for $4 a piece, so check them out if you'd like. But speaking of mythos, next week, we'll take a look at a game that didn't just world build, it spun off an entire universe. So have you guys noticed the way that RPGs have been awkwardly mating with other genres? In 2015, we've got RPG shooters, RPG sports, and RPG MMO Dragon Ball Z fighting games. Huh. But years before this sort of genre combining became a trend, there was one legendary game that mixed 3D adventure chocolate with mascot kart racing peanut butter.
It's Banjo-Kazooie!
No! Shut up, John Lovitz, not this time! Banjo-Kazooie was supposed to be the big game for Christmas 1997, but in late August, Nintendo announced that the Baron Bird would have to be delayed. But no worries, they had a surprise to fill the gap. Diddy Kong Racing! Nobody even knew this game existed, and yet a mere 3 months later, we were playing it. So how did Rare blindside us like this? To answer that question, let's back all the way up to 1987 for a game called RC Pro-Am. It was one of the most popular of Rare's many NES titles. 10 years later, and a team at Rare, who is now one of the most prolific and iconic developers in the world, is working on a sequel. Pro-Am 64! Okay, I'll stop. Behind closed doors at E3 that summer, Rare showed this game off to Shigeru Miyamoto himself. Miyamoto suggested that instead of trying to bring back the dormant Pro-Am series, why not utilize a character that Rare itself hadn't just created, but made famous? Why not give the starring role, the title role, to Diddy Kong? So a few months later, when Chris Sutherland's Banjo team realized the game just wouldn't make the Christmas deadline, Rare already had something much further along that could serve as a replacement, and the characters and story kind of speak to this iterative nature. Timber the Tiger lives peacefully on an island not too far from Donkey Kong Island. But when an alien warlord named Wizpig invades Timber's home, he writes to his friend Diddy for help. Diddy and Timber gather a group of allies. Actually, half the cast originates from the game's earlier design, 2 characters hailed from upcoming Rare games, and a Kremling even followed Diddy, I guess to make sure he doesn't accidentally commit genocide again. Along with an elephant genie and a sentient stopwatch, this group sets out to kick Wizpig back to the planet he came from. Oh, and also Wizpig is like obsessed with racing for some reason, and Timber's Island just so happens to feature a variety of racetracks, so of course that's how we're going to resolve this conflict. It's a kart racer with a plot, cut it some slack. Although actually, this is a lot more than just a kart racer. You could also race in planes and hovercraft, which let Rare design more diverse courses and opened up all kinds of versus mode combinations.
Plane versus kart, kart versus hovercraft, hovercraft versus kart, plane versus plane, kart versus kart, hovercraft versus hovercraft.
The other big innovation was the adventure mode. Like a 3D platformer of the era, Diddy Kong Racing had an explorable hub, from which you would unlock 5 worlds, each with 4 tracks. Win all 4 tracks in a world, and you'll take on a boss. Outrace the boss, and you'll go through the courses again, but this time you'll need to collect 8 silver coins on each track and come in first. Do that, and you'll challenge the boss a second time, and now they're difficult, bordering on unfair. I don't mind a cheating, conniving video game boss, but some players will find this very frustrating. If you beat the boss again, you'll unlock that world's trophy race, a traditional Grand Prix where the CPU is much more challenging. This is a nice difficulty curve. You'll have plenty of opportunity to learn the layout of each course before the ultimate trophy race, but it does seem a little bit too convoluted. There's one step too many, and it's the silver coin challenge. While sometimes they might clue you in on shortcuts, the coins are often scattered in some very inconvenient places, so it's almost certain that you'll have to play a track at least twice more to get them all, and that's if you manage to come in first. Rare could have cut down the number of silver coins and made their locations less esoteric, or just nixed the concept altogether. It's not awful, it's just repetitive, but it is the only real misstep in an otherwise fantastic design. Diddy Kong Racing was always compared to a game that came out at the beginning of '97, Mario Kart 64. It wasn't really a fair comparison, because Diddy wiped the floor with Mario! Thanks in part to the multiple vehicles, the course design was way ahead of its time, with a sense of place and variety that Mario Kart wouldn't match for years. The game was more technical and nuanced. The CPU did not cheat. The item system wasn't as flashy, but what it lacked in bombastic chaos, it made up for in balance. The focus was on skill, not luck. God, it had boss battles and mini-games and genies and keys, and an amazing dynamic soundtrack by David Wise, and TT the talking stopwatch and... Even now, I am blown away by just how well it's holding up. It's been 18 years, yet parts of it still feel so groundbreaking, so avant-garde. The one place I would give Mario Kart the edge, though, is accessibility. It's kind of like comparing Street Fighter to Smash Brothers. I love both titles, but as similar as they seemed, they were trying to accomplish very different goals. Diddy Kong Racing is more balanced, yes, but that means that how much fun you're having is tied much more closely to how good you already are. I've learned the hard way, it's not really the kind of game you can bust out at parties. It kind of occupied the same relation to Mario Kart that Sega All-Stars Racing has now. And wait a minute, Banjo was in the Xbox version of that game, and the sequel had karts and boats and planes! It all comes around. In an industry where we often know about upcoming games years in advance, that Rare, a developer so notorious for taking their time, managed to fill the gap left by Banjo-Kazooie on such short notice with a game as good as Diddy Kong Racing was a holiday miracle, a testament to what a hot streak the company was on. Everything Rare touched turned to gold. When it was released, Diddy Kong Racing garnered high praise and became the fastest-selling video game there ever was to that point. In the years since, the game's cast has forced it into a bit of a legal gray area, and their obscurity means that it's sometimes forgotten amid Rare's litany of N64 classics. And that's a shame, because this was the game that united those gems into a shared universe. Diddy Kong Racing ended on a cliffhanger that has yet to be resolved, and I still hope that Wizpig will return someday. Next week though, Donkey Kong himself is finally back to kick some tail. Oh, and to collect everything. Until then though, keep geeking! 5 years passed since the release of Donkey Kong Country, and Rare became one of the most respected and exemplary game developers in the world. With Nintendo owning 49% of the company, Rare was the workhorse of the Nintendo 64, pumping out instant classics at an astounding pace. But after we'd sent Wizpig packing, rescued Tootie, and inexplicably became James Bond fans, one question remained. Where was Donkey Kong? The character that launched Rare into the stratosphere hadn't starred in a game in years. On New Year's Day 1999, Nintendo released this image online, and our collective jaws hit the collective floor. The game had been rumored for ages, and at last, Donkey Kong 64 was on its way. By the fall, we were swept up in an incredibly healthy marketing campaign, quenching our thirst with a refreshing DK64 Dr. Pepper, gorging ourselves on almost edible DK64 Lunchables, and anxiously awaiting November 24th, 1999. Nintendo even sent out a promotional videotape, just like they'd done with DKC. The game looked absolutely amazing, and when Nintendo rolled out a demo kiosk to stores a few weeks before release, it played just as good as it looked. The demo showed off 2 epic boss fights and an exhilarating 3D upgrade of the iconic minecart stage.
So it's the same old DK, only in 3D.
Oh yes, the hype machine was firing on all cylinders. At last, the day arrived. I got my hands on that banana yellow cartridge, I swapped in the N64 expansion pack, I flipped the power switch. I sat on the edge of my seat.
Here we go.
What?
This car has a funny face.
What?
This car's one hell of a guy.
What?
Come on, Cranky, take it to the fridge.
This is the DK rap. It's goofy, it's campy, it's awful, it's the most hilarious, farcical game intro of all time. Rare had absolutely mastered character expression and animation by this point. It's also a great little preview of each character's personality and abilities. Like, take Diddy for instance. He started out as a wannabe hero, proved himself in solo adventures, became a star in his own right, and now he's almost too cocky. He shares the spotlight with 3 new characters. Chunky, who has the body of a brute and the disposition of a feather, Tiny, a flower power child of the 90s, and Linky, who's just as absurd as the DK rap itself, and who deserves every bit of adoration the internet gives him. He's a great addition to the cast, and he's certainly more distinct than Tiny and Chunky, who are fairly blatant XPs of Dixie and Kitty respectively. I mean, they're literally related. Early on, Rare decided, for some reason, that the only returning characters would be those who debuted in the original Donkey Kong Country. As development went on, they abandoned that, but by that time the playable cast had been solidified. I honestly kinda hated this when I was a kid. It would have been awesome to see Dixie in 3D, and Kitty would have also been present. You know, on second thought, Tiny and Chunky are fine. Of course, DK64 also finally returned the eponymous Kong to playable status. Donkey Kong himself is absolutely on point, from his animations to his model to his personality to even his voice.
Okay.
And while the more animalistic noises he makes nowadays are fine, this to me is the definitive Donkey Kong. Well, aside from those few instances early in the game, where on-screen dialogue paints him as a Neanderthal. That was just weird. But hey, speaking of, let's get into the game proper. At the beginning of DKC, you busted out of DK's treehouse and were thrust right into the heart of the game design. Here's how DK64 goes. You watch the story, lumber out of the treehouse, go to Cranky's new lab, learn you'll need to complete a tutorial, learn to swim, learn to throw barrels, learn to throw oranges, learn to swing from vines, drink a potion, learn to ground pound, hit a switch, learn about warp paths, meet Kay Lumsey, watch a cutscene, try and fail to jump on a naughty, because really, why would jumping on enemies do anything? Actually get to the first level, wander around, buy a coconut gun from Funky, find Diddy in a cage. The cage is locked by 3 targets that fade into existence. See you shoot a target, shoot another target, fail to shoot a target because draw distance, unintuitively find an angle that lets you shoot a target, rescue Diddy, climb all the way back up to where he was, and finally, triumphantly collect a golden banana. I was no longer on the edge of my seat. But whatever. You know, this isn't Donkey Kong Country 64. If Rare wanted to make a 3D collection platformer instead of a kinetic 2D platformer, that's fine. Here's the thing, though. 4 hours later, you might be back in Jungle Japes, wandering around as Tiny Kong, who, remember, is just one of your 5 playable characters. You'll start to head down a tunnel, only to see, hey, a trail of green bananas. Now, if they were purple, Tiny could collect them. But duh, of course, only Chunky gets to collect green things. In fact, every Kong has a litany of tchotchke crap that only they can collect. You try to hit the select button to change Kongs, but oh no, the N64 controller doesn't have a select button. Instead, you'll need to make your way back to the tag barrel, where you'll switch to Chunky, quad down the tunnel, collect those bananas, and when you finally get to the end, what do you find but a locked gate that can only be opened with the gun that shoots feathers, which only Tiny Kong gets to fire? By the time you switch back to her, it's taken you 3 minutes of gameplay to go down a tunnel and open a gate. This is the whole game. Gargantuan worlds devoid of style or substance, linked by dark, boring hallways, filled with extremely arbitrary switches and barrels and buttons. You know what? I take it back. This had no business being a collectathon. It could have been Nintendo's answer to Crash Bandicoot or Sonic Adventure, a fast-paced, linear 3D platformer. Instead, it's another iteration on the Mario 64 formula, but it doesn't do anything new. Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts gets so much hate for not being what people wanted out of a Banjo game. But is DK64 really how we wanted a 3D Donkey Kong to turn out? Heck, I'd argue that Nuts and Bolts is at least true to the spirit of Banjo. But this is not a Donkey Kong game. It's an ever-compounding series of chores. It's an interactive scavenger hunt, where the reward for finding stuff is always more stuff to find. It's monotonous, it's convoluted, it's tedious.
Wow, so it's the same old DK, only in 3D.
No, it isn't! The demo kiosk and even a lot of the marketing material obfuscated the true nature of Donkey Kong 64. Remember? 2 epic boss battles and that wonderful minecart minigame. This, I think, is representative of the game Rare wanted to make. This is what I would think of as a Donkey Kong game. Graphically amazing, fast-paced, and fun. Instead, DK64 feels like Rare took the remnants of stuff they didn't use in Banjo-Kazooie, turned up the scale of the world to an uncomfortable degree, and pasted Donkey Kong and Friends over it. This stage design sucks next to Banjo, but the tone and atmosphere are skewed so far in that direction, and it's made even more obvious since Grant Kirkhope provided the soundtrack for both games. Don't get me wrong, the soundtrack's great to listen to, and Grant is a musical genius in his own right, but there's no getting away from it. This just is Banjo-Kazooie music. And by the way, I don't mean that literally. The music that's been playing is from DK64, but you would never know that. Maybe Rare didn't have time to make a game that was less Banjo and more Donkey Kong, but even if that was the case, one simple thing could have made a difference. You needed to be able to switch characters at any time. Why do we need a tag barrel? I know the game would have chugged with all the playable Kongs on screen, but Donkey Kong Land couldn't display more than one character either, so it just threw the other into the HUD, and it still let you swap. That would have been great! If you could tag in any time, the game would become so much more palatable. I mean, it still wouldn't really feel like a Donkey Kong game, but at least you wouldn't have to scour every single enormous stage 5 times. Now maybe you disagree, maybe you enjoyed it. I know the game has its fans, and assuming any of them are still here, I'd never call anyone out for having fun wrong. To be honest, I didn't find it nearly this obnoxious in 1999. I mean, I didn't love it either, but it was okay. Here in 2015, I didn't expect to suddenly adore it, but I was surprised by just how much of a struggle it was. I had to make myself play it, and that sucks because I still want so badly to like it. There are great things about it, little morsels of brilliance. I love the story. I love the sense of character growth, and the way the world has changed since the trilogy. I love the fact that the arcade version of Donkey Kong is hidden in Frantic Factory, and I mean the actual arcade version, not the neutered NES port that Nintendo releases on everything. Rare's first game, Jetpack, is in there too, but I know I'm never going to unlock it. Rare's Donkey Kong series was all about character, atmosphere, and crisp gameplay. DK64 set the bar on character, but everything else isn't just derivative of a better game, it's half-baked in its own right. This is video game busywork, a slog of an adventure that failed to live up to its own hype, failed to live up to Rare standards, and failed in the worst way a video game can fail. It wasn't fun. Donkey Kong 64 didn't kill the 3D platformer, but it certainly made collectathon a bad word. Despite all my criticism though, DK64 was flawed in execution, not in concept. The Donkey Kong series, with its focus on distinct characters and cohesive world building, could make for a fantastic 3D collectathon platformer. And at the turn of the millennium, it seemed inevitable that Rare would get another shot. I mean, even they knew it. After all, Rare was Nintendo's most crucial developer, and a brand new Nintendo console, codenamed Dolphin, was on the horizon. Sure, DK64 was a bit of a misstep, but now that he was back, Donkey Kong's future seemed brighter than ever. Then Rare was bought by Microsoft, and the darkest period in the history of the franchise began. Donkey Kong 64 might have been a misstep as a game, but it was a critical hit in sales. The franchise was still a powerhouse, and a year later, Rare released a port of Donkey Kong Country to the Game Boy Color. It was sort of a companion Donkey Kong Land-esque game to DK64. It even runs on the Land engine. I always get a kick out of seeing a game running on vastly inferior hardware like this. There's basically no point to the game now, but it was really cool to have a portable DKC back in 2000. It's also a lot harder than the Super NES version. Rare kept the same large character sprites, but with the stage layouts on this tiny screen, you have a lot less time to react. It was obvious to everyone that the future was bright for the Big Ape. No one, seemingly not even Rare itself, had any reason to suspect otherwise. At E3 2001, Nintendo showed off a trailer for what was to be the Thriller Gorilla's first GameCube game, Donkey Kong Racing. A game that could tie up Diddy Kong Racing's loose ends, bring back our old favorites, and unite all the characters and worlds that Rare had spent the last 8 years building. And as awesome as DK Racing looked, can you imagine what a new mainline platformer might look like on the GameCube? Because we knew it was coming.
It may take 2 years. It may take 4 years. It may take 6 years. But it's coming.
I remember reading those words on the dilapidated, antiquated old fan site DKVine.com way back in 2001, and I got chills. By the way, weren't fan sites great? Web 2.0 or 3.0 or whatever on nowadays, that's fine and all, but there was a lot of charm in the passion and fun of these badly coded, badly written, horribly designed, barely functional. Okay, never mind. Maybe fan sites deserve to die out.
It's called being dedicated to your fandom.
Wait. What? The famous Heil Slush Russell of DKVine.com is more than a mere echo of a bygone era? You're still here on the internet to this day?
Fuck yeah! Check out our Patreon, subscribe to the Conversation Podcast on iTunes, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and YouTube!
That's right, Heil. And don't forget our Twitch channel.
Chad McKenna is here too? The fake paid actor Chad McKenna? Dude, I loved your work in the Sea of Thieves trailer.
The sail's blocking my vision, so you're gonna need to tell me where to steer.
I'm looking at the water, Chad. Shut up.
Didn't I also see you in a pizza commercial one time? But okay, look, I know who you guys are. And let me guess, you're the founders of DK Vine, and so you've brought your satiric yet earnest fandom to help me critique some Donkey Kong games, right?
No, Josh, we're just here to make sure that you don't besmirch the good name of Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble again. We watched your retrospective. We see that you've disgraced yourself on the altar of public taste. Frankly, I've never been more disgusted.
The Brothers Bear are better than sex. With them, you get off 14 times.
Even that statement is less revolting than the Geek critiques Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble review.
Look, dude, we can agree to disagree, but I'm not the one who said that DK64 was better than Donkey Kong Country 2.
I was 14, and I do regret that immensely.
The important thing was, if I can get back to my video, a new generation had arrived, and a new Donkey Kong game was on the way. I was hyped for Smash Bros. Melee, but as I read that ridiculous Miyamoto quote on the back of the GameCube box, I knew that the biggest reason I'd bought this system was Donkey Kong Racing. I could not wait.
But everything changed when Microsoft bought out Rare. Amicably, I might add. Remember, Nintendo owned a 49% stake in the company, and the deal couldn't have gone down without their agreement.
People won't realize that a lot was changing at Nintendo during this time. Satoru Iwata had become their new president, Howard Lincoln stepped down to oversee the Nintendo-owned Seattle Mariners, Rare lost one of their biggest allies when Ken Lobb was courted by Microsoft. Overnight, the entire culture changed at Nintendo, and Rare, who had provided hit after hit for the latter-day SNES era and the entirety of the N64, no longer fit into the company's plans. I blame 9/11.
It's the only reasonable explanation.
Rare always treated Donkey Kong as their de facto mascot, but at the end of the day, he belonged to Nintendo. With the driving force of the franchise unable to develop it any further, Donkey Kong Racing was cancelled, and the superlative simian's fate was back in Nintendo's hands. And so, we waited. We waited until 2003. It had been years since the last big game in one of Nintendo's most beloved and respected franchises. Surely Nintendo wouldn't screw up by giving the fans who had waited so long something they had never even asked for. Wait, why are we rolling footage of Metroid? Oh. Nintendo. Nintendo never changes. Because the first big game of this new era was not a return to form, no. It was Donkey Konga.
Donkey and Diddy find a set of bongos on the beach, and inexplicably have to go to Cranky to learn that they are, in fact, bongos. Donkey Kong doesn't know that these are bongos, despite the fact that DK's instrument in the last game was, of course, bongos.
Don't be stupid, Chad. These are different magical bongos that glow when you clap. And because DK is nothing if not hedonistic, he declares them the DK bongos. Donkey and Diddy decide to become musical superstars for some reason, but first they'll have to practice. And yep, that's the plot.
But here's the thing, those bongos, those are real. This is your controller. You play the game by hitting them, and there's even a sensor that picks up when you clap. To be honest, the bongos themselves are really well made, as Nintendo hardware tends to be, but God, what a weird concept. But, you know, Donkey Kong Country was legendary for its soundtrack, and a game where you play that music could actually be something special. It works for Final Fantasy now, and it could work for DK.
Yeah, what memorable melodies would we be treated to? Mining Melancholy?
Nope!
Sticker Bush Symphony?
No. We get the Smash Brothers version of the DK rap, and that, my friends, is the only Donkey Kong song in the whole game. You got a few other Nintendo tracks, the Western themes for the Kirby and Pokemon anime, a few generic kids songs like Happy Birthday and Bingo, then the bulk of the playlist is just god-awful covers of pop songs.
Somebody once told me the world is gonna roll me. I ain't the sharpest tool in the shed.
Despite this, Donkey Konga somehow got a sequel in less than a year, with a new set list and some new modes. And in Japan, where the series was actually popular, because of course it was, there was even a third Konga. In fact, every region's release had its own set list.
I guess the idea had potential, and I did begrudgingly kind of enjoy the original just for what a stupid idea it was, but there's a reason nobody is clamoring for a return of this trilogy.
Donkey Konga 2 remains one of the worst games I've ever played, and is a contender for a worst Donkey Kong game of all time. The greatest sin of this game is they somehow put even less DK music in it. In a North American version, they decided to try to make it trendy by filling it with top 40 music from the early aughts. This meant music that was in no way tonally appropriate for Donkey Kong, like Good Charlotte and Blue Cantrell. As a result, Donkey Konga 2 was the first Donkey Kong game to have a teen rating. I hate this game so much.
Just give it up, man. You're never gonna beat it.
No thanks to you. At least I had the stomach to play it longer than 10 minutes.
I stand by my life choices.
The problem was, Donkey Kong was now irrevocably chained to this thing, so any Donkey Kong game that came out on the GameCube was gonna have to use it. Even if that game was a 2D platformer. 2005 saw the release of Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. Pound on the left or right bongo to run in those directions, hit both bongos at once to jump, clap to stun enemies and grab bananas. God, that sounds stupid. Worse yet, for no reason other than a seeming lack of respect for anything Rare created, the game aimed to be a soft reboot for the whole franchise. New animal buddies serve the exact same function as existing ones. For the first time, the Kremlin crew loses their antagonistic role. In fact, other than DK himself, no other character from Rare's series even makes an appearance.
No other character besides, and I'm quoting the game's director, the banana. The decision was made to excise any and all Rare influence from the title to avoid that not-so-fresh feeling.
But on the plus side, there's no Kiddy Kong.
I will smack your Season 2 Commander Riker wannabe beard off, Josh.
Yes, and how does it feel, Heil, to know that you can never be number one?
Hey, hang on a second. I have facial hair too now.
Barely.
Okay, but seriously, if you thought Konga had a poor excuse for a plot, just you wait. I'm going to read Jungle Beat's entire story from the manual verbatim. Here it is, wedged into the contents page. Pound anything that gets in DK's way as he conquers the kingdoms and becomes the king of the Jungle Lands. Yeah, that's good enough for a plot.
Which completely misses the point of Rare's reinterpretation of Donkey Kong. Like real gorillas in nature, he was only hostile when he or his family were threatened. Nintendo really seemed keen to reinvent Donkey Kong as a toothy grin-bearing jackass during this era.
So with all of this going against it, this game was born to suck. With its blatant XPs and its goofy, cartoony aesthetics and its stupid bongo controller. But then you start playing it. You start enjoying a control scheme that has no right to feel this natural and intuitive. Level design that's bombastic and fast-paced and just so much creativity. Then you find out that the team that designed Jungle Beat would go on to create the Mario Galaxy series. And it starts to click into place. The tone might not feel like a typical Donkey Kong game, but that's easier to forgive nowadays, and I have to admit this is a really fun game. I kind of regret that Konga put me off from the bongos so much, because I think I'd have had a blast with Jungle Beat even back in 05. I didn't end up giving it a chance until the new Play Control version for the Wii years later. Here, it controls more like a traditional platformer, and overhauls a lot of the level design and mechanics to accommodate that. In fact, they even expanded on the story. It's a very different game, but either version would be worth your time. It's one of the best examples I can think of a concept that just shouldn't work, yet it does. So it's kind of the exact opposite of Kiddy Kong.
Josh, you need to stop criticizing the third game in the most perfect, wonderful, magical trilogy in the history of entertainment.
Ah, dude, that's fine. It can still be a legendary trilogy, even if one of them is kind of flawed. It's like Return of the Jedi or The Temple of Doom.
Oh, I warned you, motherfucker. I'm Hyle Russell.
And I'm Chad McCanna.
I'm Josh Wallen, and my mouth is still kind of numb. But at least I still have my beard.
Oh, what's her name?
And welcome to part 2 of the Geek Critiques DK Wrap-Up, featuring the help/abuse of the founders of DKVine.com. Thanks again, guys.
No problem. We'll just have to agree to disagree on the third game in the greatest trilogy of...
Last time, we left off at the DK Bongos, and the bevy of unusual games this unusual peripheral inspired.
And DK wasn't done with weird concepts. DK King of Swing was released for the Game Boy Advance that same year, the first of 3 DK games developed by Payon.
K. Rool steals the Kong's Jungle Jam medals, and DK pursues him through 5 worlds to get them back. Pursues him vertically. You play almost exclusively with the L and R triggers to control DK's hands and climb pegboards.
The art style is adorable and perfectly suited to a portable system, but the gameplay... The controls feel clumsy and awkward, especially at first. It's frustrating to fall down a chasm and have to work your way back up, but even after you wrap your head around the unique mechanics, it's just so slow and floaty. I don't feel the power of an enormous gorilla propelling himself through the jungle. I feel like I'm playing a weird offshoot of Clu Clu Land, which it weirdly kind of is, considering you can unlock that game's protagonist Bubbles as a playable character. It's a unique concept, but DK King of Swing is the kind of game that would feel more at home on a smartphone nowadays. A good time waster, but it's just not very engaging.
Although from our perspective, King of Swing was actually a godsend, or maybe a Queen Banana Bird send. It gave Donkey Kong Country obsessives fan service at a time when it seemed like Nintendo wanted absolutely nothing to do with Rare's characters. Wrinkly's Ghost was in this game, Neeks and Flitters from DKC2. These are considered deep cuts today, but in 2005 it was almost unthinkable.
Yeah, I can definitely see where you're coming from. It is cool to see these characters again. I just don't enjoy playing it. But it did get a sequel 2 years later on the DS, DK Jungle Climber. Wow. A little behind the scenes here. When I'm doing a video like this, I'll typically play a game and record footage, and then write about it. I played King of Swing back when it came out, but it really soured me on the pegboard concept, so I skipped Jungle Climber. So what you're seeing here is my first time ever playing this game, and putting them back to back like that, this is how you do a sequel. And once again, I hate that I originally missed out on it. I didn't think this weird genre could actually make for anything more than a diversion. But just a few levels in, it's absurd how much more evolved this is. The controls are improved, the gameplay is much snappier, the atmosphere is evocative of the Country trilogy. This is great, and I'm looking forward to playing the rest.
It's on the Wii U Virtual Console if you at home also missed out on it. But as improved as it may have been, the pegboard concept was always going to be a hard sell. For their final take on the franchise, Payon would go for a more traditional genre.
A decade out from Diddy Kong Racing, with the wounds of Donkey Kong Racing's cancellation fading into distant memory for most people, 2007 saw the release of Donkey Kong Barrel Blast for the Wii. Could this be the high-octane racing spin-off DK fans have been dreaming of?
No, it wasn't. The game spent most of its development as a GameCube title, and it shows. I mean, the outdated visuals are one thing, but the more telling sign is in the controls. Barrel Blast was originally announced as Bongo Blast, but by the time the game was nearing completion, the GameCube was dead, taking the much maligned peripheral with it.
But instead of implementing a more standard control scheme, Payon tried to replicate the precision of hitting a drum with the vague motion of swinging a drumstick around. The Wii's motion controls were just a poor substitute for the DK bongos.
But wait, the Wii had GameCube controller ports. They could have made it work, but I see how it is. Smash Brothers can get an old controller back on the production line, but I guess Donkey Kong just isn't important enough.
Sakurai needs 5 different controllers to play as his Fire Emblem anime pretty boys, but our one chance to play as K. Rool, and we get scraps.
Let it go, man. Please, breathe.
It's unfortunate that bongo controls aren't an option, but even if they had been, the game still wouldn't have lived up to what we'd hoped for. Although, this is actually another game I'm playing for the first time, and it's not as bad as I thought it'd be. I'm a little more forgiving of motion controls than your average gamer, but Barrel Blast is certainly not solid enough to come even close to greatness. It reminds me a lot of King of Swing, actually. Payon had it in him to make a truly excellent DK racing game, but it would have needed another iteration to really shine.
Across all 3 of their titles, Payon was the sole developer during this era that actually bothered to include and even expand upon the elements that Rare created to make this franchise what it was.
Actually, Chad, I can't believe that you would forget about Donkey Kong Country Barrel Maze. It's only the greatest Flash game of all time.
Is that ska?
If only I could forget. But seriously, Payon actually cared about the details. The memorable cast of characters, the respect to passage of time and plot development.
Yeah, this exhilarating moment in Barrel Blast, where I accidentally discovered On Guard was in the game, was the very instant I knew I'd find something to enjoy about it. Jungle Climber even mixes Country's tag team system into its pegboard gameplay. It's the details, you know? Alas, as respectful as Payon was to what Rare had built, the pegboard genre was just too gimmicky to really catch on, and awkward motion-controlled racing was even more so.
But speaking of which, one other company was keeping the flame alive during this era, and it might surprise you. It was Rare. Microsoft didn't have a portable system of its own, and so for a while, Rare was allowed to continue making games for Nintendo's handhelds. Thus, Rare ported the Donkey Kong Country trilogy to the Game Boy Advance.
The first is one of many unfortunate cases where the original GBA's dark screen caused developers to overcompensate with washed-out, bright visuals. But the ports get better in all regards as they go along, adding newly rendered map screens, story cutscenes, and even new bosses. But despite some modern enhancements, I don't think it's too controversial to say that the Super Nintendo originals are still the definitive versions.
Yeah, the GBA versions are considerably weaker in just about every category. The graphics are pared down. The Game Boy Advance's sound chip can't hold a candle to the Super Nintendo's. And even the sound effects are less impactful.
The Country series, especially the original, put so much focus on atmosphere and ambience, and a lot of that was lost in the transition. They don't even measure up in terms of gameplay. The physics are only an approximation of the originals, and they're not nearly as solid. Look at how much slower Rambi is. The speedy, crunchy mechanics that have kept me replaying the Super Nintendo versions for so many years just aren't quite there. On the other hand, the slower but more consistent engine means the DKC3 actually fares really well, especially since Rare had ironed out most of the kinks in the porting process by then. David Wise even composed an entirely new soundtrack for Dixie's game. And remember how I lamented the lack of atmosphere in Lakeside Limbo? Whoop, happy cartoon time! Ah, but the GBA version, on the other hand. Ah, that's more like it. With the exception of maybe 3, I'd never recommend them over the Super Nintendo originals. But that doesn't mean they weren't still fantastic platformers. Sure, they were weaker in comparison, but if you'd never played a Super Nintendo, you wouldn't know the difference. The heart of Donkey Kong Country was still there, and as the only titles of the era that combined the DKC aesthetic with the mainline series gameplay, the GBA ports were critical in bringing a new generation of younger gamers on board.
Ironically, the first Game Boy Advance remake was the best-selling Donkey Kong game during the entire decade, outselling Donkey Kong Jungle Beat by almost a time and a half.
Donkey Kong Country 2 Game Boy Advance sold more than 1 million worldwide as well. It was nice to be vindicated at a time when critics and gamers were trying to tell us that Donkey Kong Country was overrated and that nobody wanted to play them. The GBA trilogy makes for a nice supplement to the SNES games. They remind me a bit of the Star Wars Special Editions. Having dialogue during the ending in Donkey Kong Country 2 is like putting Hayden Christensen at the end of Return of the Jedi, but the extra features can sometimes be nice.
And unlike George Lucas, Rare never said that they were sorry that gamers fell in love with a half-completed game.
These ostrich races are so dense. Every single sprite has so many things going on.
We would find out a few years later that the team at Rare responsible for porting the Country trilogy were hoping to use that same engine to build a 4th Donkey Kong Country game, and that could have been awesome. Instead, Rare ended up porting Diddy Kong Racing to the DS and Tiny hit puberty and... let's just skim this one. Clumsily having to switch between touch controls and traditional controls is not good game design. And unlike the Country ports, Diddy Kong Racing doesn't really survive the process with the magic intact.
At the end of the day, these were still essentially ports. Portable ports, at that. The mainstream Donkey Kong of this era was, more and more, just an ancillary Mario character. Mario vs. Donkey Kong ignored the series' development and returned Donkey Kong to the antagonistic role that Cranky once played.
Yoshi's Island DS created an even stickier timeline wicket, portraying a modern-looking DK as a baby alongside Mario and the gang.
This fast and loose approach to continuity works fine for the Mario series, where gameplay is all that matters, but it was completely out of place for Donkey Kong. As you've seen, and as I've learned from playing some of these games for the first time, the problem was not that the DK titles of this era weren't fun games. For the most part, they were alright. But even when they were more reverential of the franchise's unique strengths, Donkey Kong was always saddled with bongo controls, motion controls, gimmicks. It became a franchise of spin-offs.
All of this would have been excusable if a traditional mainline platformer series had given the series an anchor, but more and more, Donkey Kong was extraneous.
To say Nintendo dropped the ball would be an understatement. The company either didn't understand or didn't care about what had made the franchise such a revolutionary force in the industry. Donkey Kong had fallen from grace, gone from an icon to a gimmick.
And not even the SNES titles were safe. Fanboy culture reared its ugly head, and a lot of Nintendo loyalists derided even the original trilogy as overrated, a symbol of Rare's perceived betrayal of Nintendo, because apparently these are soap opera characters and not corporations.
In turn, many hardcore DK fans turned on Nintendo itself. That definitely included us at DK Vine.
To heal this rift would be nothing short of a miracle, but a certain Western studio had proven itself a miracle worker before.
And to make it magic again. If you listen, you can hear it coming.
Meh, should have been Metroid.
In the mid-90s, just for a little while, it seemed as though Donkey Kong ruled the gaming world. The franchise and its characters seemed at times to surpass even Mario as the de facto face of Nintendo. Flash forward to the late 2000s, though, and it was tough to be a Donkey Kong fan. More than a dozen years had passed since the last entry in the mainline Country series. The GameCube era saw the franchise bound to a gimmicky bongo controller, an era when the best offerings were remakes of games from days gone by. Aside from that, more and more, it seemed like Donkey Kong was no longer a franchise player, he was just an ancillary part of the Mario cast. And by the end of the decade, it was getting tough to be a traditional Nintendo fan.
We would like to play
Early on, the Wii was very well supported with games for the casual and hardcore alike, but when it became obvious just how overtly the console had caught fire with people who didn't consider themselves gamers, the company doubled down on that demographic. And look, I'm not a gatekeeper for real gamers or whatever. I thought it was awesome that I had games I could play with my parents. It just felt like it may have been coming a little bit at the expense of people who'd been longtime fans of the company. I remember a year where it seemed like all Nintendo had was Animal Crossing. Like that was supposed to be enough for us, while Nintendo worked on Wii Music and Wii Fit and the freaking Vitality sensor. But, you know, water under the bridge, I'm not going to be bitter. The point is, Nintendo was so successful with this strategy that by 2010, even gamers who didn't give a crap about Nintendo had reason to be anxious. Sony and Microsoft had seen the Wii's success, and they were dipping their toes in that big blue ocean. So it's kind of funny. At the very same E3 where its competitors were promoting the newest of the industry's many attempts to turn you into the controller, Nintendo of America's Reggie Fils-Aimé stood on stage and said this.
As you know, Retro Studios in Texas has produced some great Metroid titles. But when they said they were ready for something new, we asked them to take one of the most treasured franchises in video game history and to make it magic again. If you listen, you can hear it coming.
That music, that landscape, I couldn't believe it. It didn't make any sense, it didn't compute, it seemed impossible. But it was real. Donkey Kong Country Returns. The fact that they included that country branding was such a good sign. Jungle Beat had just been ported to the Wii the previous year, so the way that game went out of its way to avoid referencing the Country trilogy was, like the banana, fresh in everyone's mind. We took it almost as given that Nintendo wasn't interested in promoting or building on anything that Rare had created. It's a lot like how the Metroid fandom became extremely cynical toward Nintendo after Other M. That's where DK fans were at the time. And that's exactly why this reveal caught everyone so off guard. To have the president of Nintendo of America acknowledge that the series had been mishandled, that they wanted it to be magic again, this wasn't just surprising, it was vindicating. Immediately after the conference, of course, people became skeptical of Retro Studios' ability to recapture what made the Donkey Kong Country trilogy so magical after 14 years. Yeah, they weren't turning it into a first-person coconut shooter, but they had also never made anything other than this. We may have been vindicated, but were we selfish? Were we wrong? Hey, it was the 2000s. Let's find out. The story begins not on a dark and stormy night, but on a bright and cheery day when the active volcano that was apparently beneath Gorilla Glacier explodes. We'll mourn the loss of Slipslide Ride, but the eruption has unleashed something far more heinous. The Tiki-Tak tribe. This ancient assortment of sentient flying musical instruments immediately starts hypnotizing the wildlife of DK Island and enlists them to, for some reason, steal the banana horde. But their particular brand of hypnosis doesn't have any effect on Donkey Kong, probably because he underwent occlumency training after that incident with the toy factory. Oops. And from there, it just goes seamlessly into gameplay, as the first thing you're asked to do is violently hammer the Wii Remote to violently hammer DK's unwelcome guest. No dialogue, no more cutscenes. Given what a sought-after possession the Banana Horde was, this inciting incident is more than enough. I've always been less than thrilled, though, with the Tiki-Tak tribe themselves, especially as the primary antagonists. I guess it's a unique concept, theming them all around instruments like this, but those masks don't really allow for the expressive characters that made the Kremlings so memorable. And I want to stress, I'm not deriding them just because they're not the Kremlings. They just seem to be designed for functionality first, for giving you enemies with wide, flat heads to bounce on, and the designs all kinda run together. But the Tiki-Tak tribe's reception pales in comparison to by far the most controversial thing about not just this game, but the console it's on. The waggle controls. In the 16-bit games, tapping the Y button would make the Kongs do some kind of rolling attack, and keeping it held would make them sprint. In this game, your character's speed is determined by the analog stick, which, you know, makes sense. But you don't hit a button to roll. No, don't be ridiculous. That would just be silly. No, instead, a function that you'll need to precisely time multiple times throughout every single stage of the game is relegated to flicking the Wii Remote. And you know what? It didn't bother me even a little. No, seriously, it felt like second nature by the second level. I didn't mistime it, I didn't activate it when I didn't want to, and I thought it actually felt pretty immersive when it was used to, like, beat up bosses. The reason I was in a position to get the hang of it so fast, though, is because by 2010, many Wii games had used a flick of the Wiimote as part of their control scheme. So to me, it was already as natural as hitting a button. On the other hand, all of those other games had some kind of a reason to limit the control scheme to the Wii remote. In Twilight Princess, you were mimicking a sword. New Super Mario was mimicking the NES controller. Mario Galaxy required the pointer, and Mario Kart, amazing as it seems, actually let you use different controllers. But with Returns, you're locked to the Wii remote. It is absolutely ludicrous that on a system with a Pro controller that looks this much like a Super Nintendo pad, a 2D revival of a Super Nintendo series couldn't support it. The forced waggle controls might not have bothered me, but failing to give the player the option was a tone-deaf decision that introduced an unnecessary learning curve, and even kept some people from giving the game a chance. If you fall into that camp, the game was remade for the 3DS a few years later, and on that version, all the waggle mechanics are mapped to buttons. Unfortunately, the trade-off is that it suffers from a much lower frame rate. The Wii version is 60 FPS, but the 3DS struggles to maintain its target of 30. But it is really impressive that they got it running with no other consequences on this hardware, and if you're into that sort of thing, and I really am, the 3D effect is a natural fit for the game too. Some people swear by this version, and there are a few very substantial additions that we'll get to later, but aside from one big one, I'd take waggle over a low frame rate any day. Of course, if you've got a beefy enough PC, the Dolphin emulator can give you the best of both worlds and beyond. The bulk of what you're seeing here was played on Dolphin with the same controller layout as the 3DS version at 60 FPS with a massive upscale in resolution and a fan-made HD texture pack for the 2D HUD elements. It looks gorgeous, controls perfectly, and even a rig that's a few years out of date should be able to run it at a higher res than the Wii at this point. I would call this the definitive way to play the game, if your computer can handle it. But I digress. Even if Returns had supported this controller, it still wouldn't have played like the Super NES games. This is not a retro throwback. This is a whole new style of Donkey Kong Country, and it handles a lot of things differently. Donkey Kong himself just feels different. He moves and jumps with the weight and might you'd expect of a gorilla. Dashing from a standstill has a little scampering build-up, and bouncing on enemies isn't as floaty as it was in the originals. Also, you can no longer bounce higher off enemies just by holding the jump button. You've got to time it consistently, and combined with how frantic the game can get anyway, I find the window on that is a little too strict. One of the best changes, though, is how climbing works. DKC had vines and ropes, but Returns has entire surfaces that you can cling to without any change in DK's momentum. These surfaces can even curve, and it adds a lot to stage variety. There's no longer much of an emphasis on barrels, and even aside from the waggle, rolling works completely differently. In the 16-bit titles, rolling through an enemy would extend both the speed and length of your attack. It was where a lot of that flow came from, as you could barrel through groups of enemies and build momentum. In Returns, Donkey Kong's roll has been, well, nerfed, really. Rolling in general is one of the biggest reasons this game feels so different, because rolling is also significantly faster than just running. So if you're going for speed, it's better to leap out of a roll to maintain that speed instead of barraging through enemies with it. It's not a smooth, flowing maneuver anymore, it's an explosive burst of momentum, and unless you jump, it only lasts for this long, whether you hit enemies with it or not. One signature of the classic trilogy was the way that instead of relegating player functions to like an in-game menu, a cast of characters were attached to those services. Cranky Kong gave you hints, Funky let you travel the map, Candy saved your game, and a floating star barrel served as your level checkpoint. Wait, that last one doesn't fit, does it? It's because in Returns, this pig is now your level checkpoint. But Retro only captured this particular focus to an extent. The fact is, Cranky didn't just give you hints, he antagonized you and broke the fourth wall. Funky was a dude. Candy was a love interest and an abomination. They might have been one-dimensional, but the Kongs were all characters. This pig, on the other hand, didn't even have a name and wouldn't get one until the sequel. Speaking of Cranky though, he's the one helper Kong that actually makes a return in DKC Returns. While it would have been nice if more had made an appearance, I can understand it. All their function had been made obsolete by the evolving standards of game design. You can jump around the map screen at any time, so you don't need Funky. The game autosaves, so you, mercifully, don't need Candy. All that's really left to do is run a shop, and since Cranky is the most memorable of the bunch, it makes sense that he would get the job. One other signature of the DKC series was its tag team dynamic, and so for the first time since 1995, Diddy Kong was used as DK's sidekick. But the tag team is now more of a Texas tornado. Diddy isn't really a separate playable character anymore, at least not in single player. You're always controlling Donkey Kong, and when you have him, Diddy rides on DK's back. So he works more like a traditional power-up, giving you access to more abilities and going away when he takes enough damage. Such a change necessitates that those abilities are worth it, and oh, they are. The roll move when you have Diddy is massively buffed. It just barrels along the ground, and can go on as long as the terrain does. And of course, you can still go over a ledge and jump out of a roll. Diddy also comes with his rocket barrels, letting you get more distance and more importantly, more control out of your jumps. But one downside to making Diddy more of a power-up than a second character is that stages no longer have to feature him. It's not uncommon for you to be able to pass a checkpoint with Diddy, but if you die, there's no way you're getting him back. It's not necessarily a negative, but it is a little awkward that the only way to have another shot with him is just to go to another stage and get him. Well, unless you're playing multiplayer. The 16-bit games had a couple different ways to let you switch off in multiplayer, but I never covered those modes. I mean, it was nice that it was there, but it felt a bit tacked on. And I mean, I guess it had to be, given how the games were designed. But in Returns, both players play co-op at the same time. Unlike the 90s trilogy, and unlike certain newer 2D platformers, it actually feels for the most part that this game was designed with two-player in mind. You never collide with each other, and defeated enemies even stick around for a few seconds, so both players have an opportunity to bounce on them. The second player can hop on DK's back at any time if a section gets too tough, and you can spend a life to come back instantly if one of you dies. The only time it does get a little dicey is in the minecart and rocket barrel stages, but these would have to lose a lot to be playable simultaneously, so I don't mind it. My initial playthrough of this game was pretty much all done in multiplayer, and it was a blast. This is how you do a co-op platformer. The first game had this weird little move called the ground pound. It was fun, I guess, but it was really situational. It could uncover hidden items, but not the ones that were visibly buried. It was just an odd ability, and it was totally possible to get through the whole game without ever using it. No surprise, the sequels did away with it entirely. Until now, the ground pound in Returns is one of the most important moves in your repertoire. It doesn't have that weird wind-up and delay anymore. It's totally instant, and it has to be because it's used for so many things. It can still uncover items, but it can also stun enemies, demolish terrain, and activate set pieces. It makes a lot of sense, bringing Donkey Kong's strength to the forefront of his moveset, and I love it. But kind of the opposite of the ground pound is the blowing mechanic. Where the ground pound feels great and makes sense for the character, blowing on things is a clunky maneuver requiring you to awkwardly position yourself next to things. It's also more laggy than the ground pound, and I really question what sort of thought process would lead to this being a sensible move for Donkey Kong. It's occasionally used for some cool moments, and it's neat when it's used to blow out the fire enemies, but mostly I just feel like it has too much overlap with ground pounding without being anywhere near as fun. Since the actual result of what they do is so similar, ground pounding and blowing can lead to a lot of starting and stopping, which, if you let them, break up the flow of the gameplay. You could be totally immersed in the feel of the game, only to be pulled out if you need to break that thing or blow on that dandelion. Now, like I said, they're also used for a lot of set-piece moments or discovering hidden rooms, but I do feel like stages are filled with way too many background elements that only exist to justify these moves. And I mean, it's at least a plus that each stage archetype has its own things to break or blow on, but a lot of them don't even give you anything. However, I can kind of excuse this potential interruption of flow for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it's only potential. There's absolutely no reason you have to search out everything. One of the many things the original trilogy did well was nailing that balance and allowing the player to choose between action and exploration. If you wanted to barrel your way through levels with all the finesse of a pounding drum, you'd have a blast. But if you wanted to take your time, soak in that ambience, and find all the secrets, that could be just as fun. The games were accommodating to either approach. Donkey Kong Country Returns recaptures this balance, and it might even do it better in some ways. Every single level is brimming with secret areas to discover and things to collect, but every single level is also designed in such a way that a skilled player can barrage through them with a speed and grace worthy of the aesthetic, and in fact they have to be built with speed in mind. There's a new time trial mode with a ludicrously high skill ceiling, which actually requires you to master every single beat of a level. But maybe the greatest indication of this approach to balance is in two of the collectibles. Kong letters, and puzzle pieces. The Kong letters aren't really hidden. They're in plain sight, but they tend to require the player to pull off a risky move to get them. But they don't grant an extra life anymore. Instead, getting every Kong letter in a world unlocks a K temple stage. This is one of those bits of new series lore that really fits. The idea that the Tiki's revival sparked these temples to appear. I love the ancient technology aesthetic, but I love playing them even more. Look, the game is normally tough, but these stages just drive you crazy. They ask so much of you. The mechanics all come together and there's so much tension and pressure and you just die over and over again. But it's exhilarating, and all that challenge makes getting to the end so satisfying. But let's set that aside for now and contrast that with the new collectible, puzzle pieces. Unlike the Kong letters, you'll have to actively search for them. They're hidden throughout the stages themselves, but they're also rewards for completing bonus stages. Collecting them will unlock, well, a bonus. Stuff like a piece of concept art or a diorama. Look, like I said a billion times in the Metroid series, I'm not a completionist. So my approach to puzzle pieces is simple. I'll get them if I come across them, but I never go out of my way to find them all. I mean, look, the Kongs don't even mind losing bonus stages anymore. But that's kind of the beauty of it. You out-challenge, you'll get more of it as a reward for proving your skill by grabbing those Kong letters. Would you rather explore? You'll also be rewarded with bonus content. Do you maybe want to find everything, but you suck at actually doing so like I do? Cranky lets you hire squawks, who will help seek out puzzle pieces. Is the game's difficulty overwhelming? Cranky also sells power-ups that protect you from crashes, give you more hit points, and even make you invincible. The 3DS version even adds a new mode. Literally, new mode. Nintendo's so good at naming things. New mode makes the game easier by giving the Kongs more hit points and items. And if you die too many times in a stage, both versions will even give you the option to just show you how to play it and let you move on, although you don't get any of the collectibles this way. Watching a game instead of playing it would kind of miss the point for me, but hey, I was a kid who couldn't beat anything without a Game Genie once upon a time, and there's nothing wrong with having options. What's telling is that neither the puzzle pieces or the time attack medals even count towards your completion percentage. I love this approach. The developers are giving you the freedom and the incentive to play the game in the way that's the most fun for you. Of course, I'd find the puzzle pieces a lot more fun if the bonus stages they were tied to were more interesting. Now, I don't have a problem with puzzle pieces in stages, and in fact some of them are hidden really cleverly. Moments like this, where you have to notice the potential for the background elements to form a certain shape, are another indication of what a good fit Retro was for this project. But every single bonus stage just boils down to grabbing a bunch of stuff within a time limit. And there are only a handful of types. Like, the aesthetic is the only thing that differentiates World 1's bonus stages from World 8's. Even Donkey Kong Country 1 had slightly more variety than this, but I guess the original did also suffer from simplistic, repetitive bonus stages. And since Returns is similarly kicking off a new series, I can give it a pass. This time. Unfortunately, one way it pales in comparison to the original is in its use of animal buddies. Or to be more accurate, the lack thereof. DKC1 had 4 rideable buddies, plus Squawks held a light in that one stage. In return, Squawks is also in a support role, and the most famous animal buddy is back, Rambi. True to the game's style, he's more powerful than ever, invincible to everything except fire, and to be fair, he is thrilling to play as, crashing through barriers and destroying set pieces, but he's only in 4 stages, and he's the only rideable buddy in the game. Like I said, I'll excuse some things in light of this being the first game in a new series. I do still wish there was a way to play as Diddy in single player, or to have him take point. I do wish other animal buddies and Kongs had shown up. I do think it loses something in terms of momentum, and the ability to switch characters lent the older games a little more variety. But in sacrificing this variability, Returns becomes more consistent than the classics. Bottom line is, the game design and the approach are very different, but that crunchy core is still there, and ultimately, it's as solid as ever. And boy, does it need to be solid. I remember when the E3 reveal happened, there was a lot of concern about this. The heart meter in a Donkey Kong game! Oh, Nintendo. Caving to those filthy casuals again, are we? Remember when Nintendo made real games? But we were so wrong. It might let you take 2 hits per Kong, but DKC Returns turns out to be exponentially more difficult than its 16-bit ancestors. Nearly every stage has a gimmick that's taught via that old-school skill curve. The concept is introduced, then it's used in situation after situation, ever increasing in complexity, twisting as it goes with other gimmicks to create this exhilarating degree of challenge. Unlike the older games, and more obviously, unlike most 2D revivals of retro franchises, DKC Returns actually puts modern hardware to use to create hazards that never could have been done in 16-bit. Waves crash in from the background, flinging enemies and items alike and forcing you to seek out shelter. A freaking octopus chases you down through an entire level. Physics are often used in ways that the Super Nintendo just wasn't capable of, with platforms shifting under DK's weight and entire structures collapsing. But even a more traditional DKC element like blast barrels are so much more impactful in Returns. Just having a camera that can swing through the environment like this gives them a lot more scope. The pace tends to be way more frenetic than the older games, but I think in light of that, people forget that it's not just a bombastic spectacle. This is not like the difference between classic Sonic's momentum and platforming versus the Boost game's non-stop energy. Returns still has plenty of slower stages based around more traditional platforming. It has plenty of ambience. It's just not the same realistic ambience of the original game. Most famously, these silhouette stages are just breathtaking, and all three of them manage to convey a completely different feel. On the flip side, the minecart stages have been so bolstered by the Wii's hardware, they really do superannuate the classics, which makes a lot of sense. In those original games, these were already the bombastic, fast-paced stages, and Returns invigorates them with hazards and designs that never could have even remotely been done on the Super Nintendo. When the track starts breaking apart or getting cut in half, it can be such an adrenaline rush, and it's a testament to how well designed they are that I always feel like I have enough time to react to this stuff. They even incorporate platforming sections and vary things up now. Minecarts are just a perfect fit for the game's style. That ebb and flow between methodical precision platforming and all this spectacle makes the highs all the more thrilling. It really surprised me that a developer who never made a 2D platformer could practically master the pace of a game like this. Stages never overstay their welcome. Well, almost never. The counterpart to the minecarts are these new rocket barrel stages. They're also linear and vehicle-based, but they're not nearly as well designed. What kills it here are the controls. Or to be more accurate, the control, because all you can do is hold down the A button to ascend, and you automatically fall when it's not held down. There's this intentional lag that keeps you from changing directions too quickly, so there's a rhythm you have to master to even go in a straight line. Why is all of this screen real estate back here not being used? Oh, it's so they can put things behind you sometimes. Now you have to pay attention to dodging obstacles from two different directions with such limited controls when you die in one hit. Other stages constantly zoom the camera in and out, so why not just move the player forward when they want to do that? The late game rocket barrel stages in particular are the one time Returns really wore on me. They can be such a repetitive chore to get through. Well, technically I guess the rocket barrel isn't entirely new. Yeah, what a surprise. Josh is dismissive of something that's originating from DKC3. But this style of stage isn't anything like that game's, and the point stands. The vast majority of the music is made up of adaptations of tracks from the original game. Some have taken issue with this, but it never bothered me. I mean, most of the level tropes and even the setting itself are the same as Donkey Kong Country, so it feels right for the music to hail from it too. Especially since most of them are really strong remixes and are often put to use in new ways. Like, it's a great touch how the map screen music changes in each world now. For that matter, it's a great touch that the whole map is now just one big model. Makes the whole adventure feel nice and interconnected. Very occasionally, the melancholic DKC tracks don't gel well with the over-the-top approach, like when the tranquil, introspective aquatic ambience track plays, while a massive whale crashes through pirate ships. There are some new tracks as well, but they don't tend to be nearly as catchy or memorable. I mean, they're serviceable, but aping David Wise's greatest hits was the right call. I cannot help but smile every time one of those old familiar tunes would hit. Due to how fast-paced and difficult this game is, it demands that you stay engaged. You can't really focus on anything else when you're playing Returns because it asks so much of you. I can kick back, relax, and speed through DKC2 without really thinking about it. I mean, it used to be a hard game once upon a time, but even when it wasn't anymore, the flow of its design has kept me coming back all these years. Returns' much higher difficulty, coupled with its decreased emphasis on kinetic momentum, causes it to lose some replayability for me compared to the classics. I've beaten the original trilogy dozens of times, but this is only my third time through Returns. This might not be a game to relax with, but that's not at all a bad thing, and the difficulty really helped Returns stand out in the modern industry. It wasn't going to be able to set a new standard with its graphics the way the original did, so it makes up for that with its ability to challenge even those longtime gamers who loved and mastered those classics. Where the originals immersed you with an atmosphere that was unparalleled at the time, Returns immerses you through its mechanics, the way it forces you to stay aware of every action you take. In the hands of a less competent developer, levels so challenging might have felt like obstacle courses. But Retro Studios did their homework. An immersive, cohesive design is one of the most critical strengths of the Donkey Kong Country series. That concept was set back in the original game. It was way ahead of the curve, being realistic and atmospheric at a time when games couldn't usually be anything except cartoony. But by 2010, the industry had figured out atmospheric a little too well sometimes, and so DKC Returns goes for a more ostentatious style. Despite this, the level design is still rooted in believability. Platforms don't just float in midair, they're connected to the terrain. Now, very rarely I had trouble discerning that terrain from the foreground, like that ledge gets me every time, but the environment and the way the characters and enemies impact it are more believable than they ever could have been with pre-rendered tiled backgrounds. At the start of a new stage, you're usually even traversing out of the previous level's aesthetic. The attention to world building that Retro proved so capable of in the Prime series made them a perfect fit for Donkey Kong, and it's wonderful to see them get to go in a more vibrant direction. While many of the world themes are inspired by the original DKC, Retro only uses that as a jumping off point. For instance, before you can break back into Crimcroc Industries, you'll have to go through an entire world made up of these cliffs the factories are pumping oil into. This area was only previously visible on the original game's map screen, and when you do finally get into those factories, they're completely distinct in gameplay and tone from the originals. The factory might actually be one of my favorite worlds. There's a series of stages where you have to find switches to power up a rocket, puzzles that harken back to Retro's Prime pedigree, and even a short vertical rocket barrel stage that controls way better than the others. Unfortunately, the final world doesn't quite match that level of quality. It's in the volcano the Tikis erupted, and while that makes sense within the context of the story, well, look, the volcano destroyed one of Donkey Kong Island's most iconic frontiers, Gorilla Glacier, and I wish this world had a little more pathos. I wish it made the player feel the loss and the threat more. Calling back to those gorgeous ice caves, which are now pouring lava and melting as you traverse them, while listening to some menacing, somber remix of Slip Slide Ride, could have directly appealed to the emotions and the nostalgia of a player, and gotten them to want to seek vengeance against the enemies who did this. Instead of that, Returns Volcano is aesthetically just a very generic video game world. Although at least it is a new archetype, compared to DKC1's anticlimactic barrage of even more caves. Actually, I guess one neat way of looking at it is that these lava stages from DKC2 have long been rumored to have been designed for DKC1, but were cut for time. So I guess it's cool that we finally did get some kind of volcano on DK Isle. But this world is also the one part of the game where challenge sometimes passes over into cheapness. Look, the final world should definitely be hard, but when there's no reasonable way a player could have seen an obstacle coming unless they just decided to stop, it's too much trial and error. It's still an above average set of platforming stages, and the final silhouette stage is particularly phenomenal, but the world as a whole doesn't quite feel congruent with the level of quality the game's maintained to this point. And that speaks to something else I've noticed. When Retro Studios appropriated and modernized something from the classics, it tended to go well. The ground pound, the minecarts, Rambi, the approach to level design, the musical remixes, all of these are spectacular. But when Retro invented original concepts for this game, they aren't necessarily bad per se, they just don't tend to be as strong. The blowing mechanic, the rocket barrel, the new music, the enemy designs, and the final world, these all feel comparatively undercooked, like Retro is playing it a little too safe. And that also goes for one more thing. The bosses. Most of the original game's bosses were a bit dull, but they were also over in no time. As the series went on, the bosses got more complex and interesting, but aside from the end-game, a skilled player could always tear through any of them in a minute or two. Retro's bosses follow a more modern formula. They go through sequences that scale in difficulty, and I do still enjoy the majority of them, but I find they fall into the same trap that a lot of Metroid Primes did. The sequences repeat way too many times, testing the player for things that they've already proven they can do. It's frustrating, especially in the late game, to die to something that you couldn't have seen coming and have to repeat such a long fight. I actually asked one of Rare's writers, Chris Alcock, about Returns on Twitter, and without missing a beat, he made a crack about how long it takes to actually defeat a boss in this game. Though it should be noted, he also thinks Retro did a fantastic job bringing back the series, and thank you for allowing me the honor of quoting you, sir. The final boss of Returns is the mastermind behind the whole banana thieving plot, Tiki Tong, set at the peak of DK Island. In contrast to most of his subordinates, I actually quite like his design. He's way more expressive than the rest of them, and the way he laughs and taunts the player makes him come across as unhinged and dangerous. Oh, and he is dangerous. He shoves just a small sampling of the banana horde into his top, and then... Retro, always expanding lore and making it make sense. Because as we learn here, DK's banana horde has never just been a bunch of ordinary bananas. Eating them gives Tiki Tong a massive and magical boost in power, which after 16 years, it justifies why Donkey Kong's enemies were always trying to steal them. But the actual fight against him is another example of Retro being a little too generic. Yeah, does this remind you of anything? Yeah, that one's obvious, but yep, there it is. On the bright side, he's tough as nails and more importantly, has a flurry of cool attacks that never overstay their welcome. As is tradition, the final boss is also the best. Beating him triggers an explosion of magical energy that hurtles DK into space. Into space. What? Shouldn't the moon colliding with the planet cause more, I don't know, catastrophe than that? And, is it just gonna set that? No. Yeah. Oh, okay. This ending, and it pains me to say this, but this ending is even worse than Donkey Kong Country 3's. Like, yeah, dropping an egg on K. Rool was a horrible anticlimax, but at least it was tonally in line with the rest of the series. Returns tends to be much more over the top, but in every other instance it still maintains at least a degree of verisimilitude with what came before. But this ridiculous moonshot isn't even in line with how Returns has presented its world to this point. It veers way overboard into cartoony nonsense, and the moon somehow just plonking itself back into the sky is even worse. Ah well, the horde erupting out of the volcano is a great image to end on, and look, a golden temple's been revealed. Oh, they are building this thing up, but you need to beat all of those strenuous K-Temple stages to unlock it. Alright, Returns, I've beaten your worst. What's my reward? Huh. No, I don't even mind this. I don't know what was in that banana, but it was definitely magic, so I actually think this justifies itself a lot better than the ending. The music in this stage even remixes the DK Jr. theme, calling back to our modern Kong's origins. It breaks hard from the rest of the aesthetic to the point that it kind of feels like a completely different game, but that also means it really stands out. It's just one stage, but you're not gonna forget it. On the other hand, it's just one stage, yet it's so built up with cutscenes and hype, it feels like it's gonna be so much more substantial than it is, and oh look! It's the 3DS version. There, the Golden Temple still ends with that same whimsical stage, but prior to that, it's got an entire world to get through. These stages are, honestly, some of the more brilliantly designed levels in Returns, which is impressive considering that Retro Studios had nothing to do with them. No credit for that goes to the studio that ported Returns to the 3DS, Monster Games. And if they've proven themselves this capable, I wouldn't mind seeing them take the reins of the series if Retro is finished with it. So after all that, did this game live up to its promise? Did Retro Studios succeed in making Donkey Kong Country magic again? Well, I have spent a lot of time in this critique comparing Returns to the games that inspired it. There are things it did different, things it did better, and things it did worse, but the 16-bit Donkey Kong Country was undeniably the jumping-off point for the game design, and so comparing them like this is only fair. However, it is impossible for me to hold it up to those classics in a way that's remotely fair. Donkey Kong Country Returns was a game I loved playing when I was 22, but Donkey Kong Country 2 was a game that solidified my lifelong love of the medium when I was 8. It doesn't matter how good the newer game is, it's never going to be able to eclipse those memories. Keeping that in mind, I do think that Retro's game loses a degree of charm that the originals, even the third one, maintained. The lack of characters and animal buddies, and even the way the core gameplay has been changed, serve to de-emphasize the feeling of community, of cohesion, of style that Rare brought to the franchise. I want to stress again that defining what makes a game stick with you is incredibly subjective, especially when you're comparing a game that you played when you were a kid versus one that you played when you were an adult. If I had played Returns when I was 8, I don't think I'd have noticed any of this stuff. And if I'm being honest, a lot of these criticisms didn't even occur to me until the sequel to this game fixed them. So it's not gonna stand up to my childhood nostalgia. So a few things about it feel tonally off. That doesn't take away from the fact that for 99% of the game, every time I've played it, I have had an amazing time. It's so solid, so fun, and most importantly, so challenging, to a degree that very few modern games are, especially ones that look like this. Find me another game released in the last 10 years that's this bright, this vibrant, and this tough. I think Retro had a reason to take this approach, and it speaks to their strength as a developer. Rareware made their name by taking Nintendo's concepts and building them to even greater heights. If you'll pardon the pun, they were that rare developer that could actually outplay Nintendo at their own game, and when the two companies aligned, it was pure magic. Retro Studios did not recapture that magic, but Reggie never said they would. He said they would make it magic again. And in that way, Retro Studios is an appropriate name, because just as they had done before, they proved themselves the masters of understanding the nuance of a franchise that had burned out generations before. 2D platformers were making a comeback in 2010, but most of them leaned hard on pure old-school appeal. There's nothing wrong with that, but Retro Studios isn't about iterating on what worked 20 years ago. And I'd even argue that a straight remake of DKC in a 3D engine would have been counter to what made it special in the first place. So Retro took the risky path, and in doing so, raised the bar of what a 2D platformer should be in the modern era without losing the soul of what made the series legendary. Donkey Kong Country Returns is a magical game, not because another game was magic 20 years ago, but because Retro Studios made it their own. It is, far and away, my favorite game on the Wii. After a few years of uncertainty, Nintendo was ready to make games like this again. Donkey Kong had returned to prominence, and this one game would go on to single-handedly outsell the entire Metroid Prime trilogy. Back at E3 2010, right before Returns was revealed actually, a brand new Metroid game was shown off. Perhaps that raises a question. If Returns really was that much of a success, then how come when a sequel was announced, those hardcore Nintendo fans who should have loved it reacted like this?
Next is a title that we are announcing for the first time in this Nintendo Direct. First, please watch this video.
Maybe it was Iwata's characteristic understated delivery, but when Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze was revealed during E3 2013, I was speechless. I mean, I was excited, but like, do you ever get so surprised by something that it takes your brain a second to even recognize that no, seriously, this is really happening? And then while I was still trying to process that, this happened. Dixie Kong, my all-time favorite video game heroine, would be making her first playable appearance in a mainline game in 17 years. In my memory, June 11th, 2013 stands as one of my favorite announcements in Nintendo's history, and it stands alongside all of those legendary keynotes. At least that's how I'd like to remember it. But then I clicked over to a certain gaming news blog, and I saw a headline that seemed almost designed to do nothing more than knock me down a peg. Retro's next big game is another damn Donkey Kong Country. This was not an unpopular opinion. So what went wrong? How exactly could a direct sequel to such a well-regarded game, a game that reviewed well, that sold well, that had seemingly re-established Donkey Kong Country as one of Nintendo's premier franchises, how could its mere announcement be the catalyst for so much saltiness? I believe that Donkey Kong Country is a series with a great deal of brand recognition, but not a lot of brand identity. To articulate this, let's do a thought experiment. Suppose that in 1998, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time was released under the exact same circumstances and had the same impact. It was defined as a masterpiece, and in turn, a generation of gamers defined it as one of their favorites. But here's the twist. What if for the next 15 years, for some reason, the only new Zelda games were ports and weird spin-offs on handheld systems? Concurrently, suppose Link kept appearing alongside Mario and the gang in Mario Party and Mario Kart and so on and so forth. And while Link himself was playable, his supporting cast and thematic elements were scarce. No Zelda, no Ganondorf, not even a hint of Hyrule. Well, maybe Tingle was his partner in Double Dash. There's your bone, Zelda fans, don't lose hope! If Link was identified as a Mario character for long enough, even if a real Zelda game finally came out, it's not going to make up for the fact that an entire generation or two of gamers were introduced to Link with Mario's very different aesthetic and approach. The longer this was the status quo, the more the Zelda series would lose its identity, and I think that's exactly what happened to Donkey Kong after Rare was sold to Microsoft. Aside from those lucky enough to play the GBA remakes, this is how most gamers who became gamers after Rare was sold knew Donkey Kong. Therefore, the vast majority of the demographic that would appreciate Donkey Kong Country grew up with it during the franchise's apex in the mid-90s. The play-it-loud generation, if you will. Gamers a little older tended to have way more reverence for NES-era franchises. Gamers a little younger knew Donkey Kong as a part of the Mario cast. So if this is how you think of Donkey Kong, why would you want that weird, toothy Mario character to get yet another game when such a talented developer as Retro could be making something more unique and significant? Because beneath that, beneath anything even having to do with Donkey Kong, this backlash came down to three simple words. Even when they weren't stated outright, they were the undercurrent of the entire controversy. Should've been Metroid. The announcement of Tropical Freeze left me speechless, but in retrospect it really shouldn't have been so surprising. The reason it was is because I was a connoisseur of gaming media, and the sheer force of Nintendo fan osmosis had me all but convinced that Retro was working on a new Metroid Prime. This despite the fact that at the time I wasn't even a fan of Metroid, so imagine what a letdown it was for people who were. Never mind that DKC Returns had, all by itself, sold more units than all 3 Prime games combined. Never mind that the vast majority of Prime's development team had left Retro Studios by this point. And let's definitely not think about the fact that Retro Studios chose to make another Donkey Kong Country title because they felt there was plenty more to do with the franchise. No, none of that mattered. This reaction wasn't about Retro doing what they wanted, or about Nintendo doing something sensible from a business perspective. This was about Nintendo failing to do right by its fans. Metroid Other M was near universally seen as an insult to Nintendo fans in general, and Metroid fans in particular, and these fans felt like they were owed a return to form from the series. When it was revealed that no, actually Retro was working on a dumb cartoony platformer, instead of reclaiming their rightful spot as the saviors of Metroid, it was like pumping salt all over that open wound. And Metroid's fans, battered and bruised, responded in kind. And you know what? I do see where they were coming from. DKC and Metroid turn out to have a lot in common. They're both franchises that operate outside the boundaries of your usual Nintendo style, with niche but very dedicated fandoms that have each gone through extended periods of being largely ignored. That aside, it's certainly true that a new Metroid game would have at least satisfied a unique segment of Nintendo fans, and given the Wii U's library was abundant with platformers, a new Metroid could have been a smidge more of a system seller than Tropical Freeze. But that's the thing. Even in the best case scenario, a Metroid game would have appealed only to a different sect of hardcore Nintendo fans. Truth be told, this entire rage fest between Metroid fans and DK loyalists was barely a blip on the radar. Why? Because even by 2014, nothing could have saved the Wii U. Look at the Wii U software over the first year and a half or so of its life. Nintendo was developing games under the assumption that the system would capture the same widespread appeal as its predecessor, and would manage to do it in the exact same way. There's really no better proof of that than the name of the console itself. The wider gaming community largely saw the Wii as an underpowered, casual-tastic mess of a console, and branding its successor the same way meant that it carried that same reputation. But that vast blue ocean of non-gamers that had made the Wii such an unexpected success didn't care, and more critically, didn't even know about Nintendo's new console. In these conditions, the Wii U name and the software Nintendo was developing became a liability, an albatross. And once a product gets a reputation as a failure, even if the company fixes the problems with it and course corrects, the idea of what it is can be almost impossible to overcome. Look at No Man's Sky. They're still adding things to it, but I saw this headline and couldn't help but laugh that they're even still trying. Windows Vista was a solid operating system after the first service pack, but everyone knew it was a failure, and so it was. The Dreamcast was a wonderful console, but Sega's reputation preceded it. So it was with the Wii U. The only people interested were already hardcore Nintendo fans. Now remember what we established earlier. Donkey Kong has a great deal of brand recognition but a lack of identity. It had been diluted over more than a decade of misrepresentation. So then where did all these sales for Returns come from? They came from the blue ocean. They came from the millions of people who bought a Wii for Wii Sports, who knew and recognized Donkey Kong as a character. Of course, what they got was a game far more difficult than they were probably expecting. I actually bought a copy of Returns off of a dad at a game store during the production of this episode. He told me his kid loved Donkey Kong, and it looked like a game they'd enjoy, but his son had never even made it out of the first world because it was too hard. Games as challenging as Returns just don't look like this anymore. They look like this, or this. They feature mature themes. There's nary a sign of sentient cartoon animals. And while I don't know if it could have made a dent, Nintendo's marketing did little to help the problem. It seems like there might have been a way to embrace what sets DKC apart, to let people know that it's a tough-as-nails game for those that crave a challenge. Maybe they could have even brought back the Play It Loud campaign to really get the attention of old-school fans, which, by the way, they actually did years later when the original trilogy came out for the Virtual Console. But no, instead of that, it was just a bunch of gameplay trailers, as if word of mouth would be enough. This was all emblematic of Nintendo's problem with marketing through the entire Wii U cycle. No matter what Tropical Freeze actually was, people would only see it as yet another cartoony Nintendo platformer. It's taken me a long time to come to terms with this. Aside from a small niche of fans that grew up with a Super Nintendo, DKC never had the respect and reverence among gamers that series like Metroid and Zelda enjoy. Therefore, Donkey Kong Country Returns was successful because the Wii was successful and the character was widely recognized. Tropical Freeze, in turn, failed because the Wii U failed, and failed for the same reason, because its predecessor had failed to turn the Blue Ocean into people who would self-identify as gamers. This bitter pill would have gone down easier if the game was just a sequel on the same level as Returns, but what kills it for me is that Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze was worth every bit of hype that I had for it. Tropical Freeze is built on the foundation of Returns. It still has DK as the primary character, and his partners still function more like power-ups than tag team partners. But Retro Studios, just like Rare before them, wouldn't have been satisfied with a sequel that merely did more of the same. The story sees the four Kongs celebrating DK's birthday, and it's such a brief little scene, but man was it ever great to see these guys again. Then, everything changed when the Ice Nation attacked. A fleet of new antagonists called the Snowmads show up, and on the order of a mysterious leader, place DK Island in a deep freeze and evict its heroes. Narratively speaking, the Snowmads are a huge step up in escalation from what's come before. Previous enemy groups have caught the Kongs off guard and stolen their bananas. The Snowmads roll in and just effortlessly claim the entire island. And especially after how rote and boring the Tikis were, the Snowmads stand out in their design all the more. They're fantastic antagonists in the same way the Kremlings were. I'd never even really noticed how they attack you directly, how expressive they are. In fact, all the characters in this game are really well animated, and you can tell how much love, attention, and budget went into this one. Literally blown away from their own home, the Kong's adventure will take them back toward DK Island. Returns aesthetics were a bit held back by the game's primary setting being a place we were so familiar with. I mean, they did well with what they had, but setting the game on DK Island was one of the many ways Returns played it safe, and leaned on nostalgia to relaunch the series. Tropical Freeze then feels consciously designed to allow Retro Studios to flex their creative muscles. Returns took place on one island, but in Tropical Freeze, each world is an island unto itself. The level design in Tropical Freeze, from its aesthetics to its mechanics to its momentum, is quite simply some of the best I've seen in a video game. Even more so than Returns, it realizes the potential of what a Donkey Kong Country could be. Stages seem like fully realized environments, with enough attention to detail and depth that you just want to wander back into that Z-axis, and you feel like if you could, the world would still be convincing. It was probably the pre-rendered graphics, but there was always something a little uncanny about the way the Super Nintendo trilogy looked. It was something that gave the series a unique thematic identity, and maybe that's why Tropical Freeze starts with a Bermuda Triangle-inspired island that causes airplanes, as well as gunships, to have engine failures. The result is a set of stages that feature a slightly off-putting natural setting, marred with the wreckage of the planes that have crash-landed there. Later, there's a savanna of festival animals that move in time with the music, and an underground cave system inhabited by cheese-packing rats. The familiar jungle setting is even turned on its head by an island-spanning factory of humongous fruit. I mean, you'll be swimming through the juice. And there's a beehive where parts of the environment get stuck in honey. Stuff this out there is sort of like how DKC2 took on a more over-the-top aesthetic that still managed to stay believable. Because no matter how creative and innovative they get, the stages never stop being cohesive. Some of them feature a sort of narrative progression throughout. For instance, a rocket barrel stage where a Snowmad general tries to take you down with a ridiculous fruit-fighting Megazord. He auto-ejects at the end of the level, and if you hang around for a second, you'll see him get eaten by these plant enemies, which in turn the Kongs will contend with in the very next stage. There's a level where the Kongs encounter these flaming hedgehogs that start brush fires. Later on, a tornado kicks up, and those same enemies are now flying obstacles, and the next level deals with the aftermath of this fiery tornado. Creativity and cohesion like this are just all over the game, both within stages and as a through point within worlds. Returns was great to play, but its lack of characters and occasional tonal problems robbed it of some of the thematic style that the original trilogy enjoyed. That's why Tropical Freeze, right from the start, establishes a familial connection between its heroes. While you are still controlling DK in single player, having Diddy, Dixie, and even Cranky along for the ride does a lot to establish the character connection that Returns was lacking. But I did always think it was a little weird that Cranky seemed so gung-ho about being here, though. I mean, man, he thought games had forgotten how to be games 20 years ago. It's hard to reconcile Rare's Cranky Kong as as wanting anything to do with a game like this, let alone being a playable character in it. But maybe seeing as he was the original Donkey Kong, seeing as the Snowmads did so effortlessly take over the island he founded, Cranky feels he has to take the fight to them regardless of the circumstances. Or maybe I'm just thinking too much about the character motivations of a bearded cartoon gorilla. Yeah, there's a reason I call it the Geek Critique. I was so hyped to play as Dixie again, and she is phenomenal. Her helicopter-y hair thing carries her upward, and you can even space out her float to stall in midair to correct mistakes. In fact, you know what? She's a little too good. Now that's not a problem per se, but it means Cranky, and especially Diddy, almost never feel like the optimal choices. I was so hyped she was back that I'd have gone with her every chance I got anyway, and I did back in 2014, but I made a concerted effort to pick the other two more often this time around. Scrooge McDuck's, Cranky's cane bounce can occasionally hurt tougher enemies and let you traverse terrain, and I was surprised to find that it had so much utility. His bounce maintains momentum, which often makes him the best choice if you're going for speed, but it's otherwise kind of a situational move, and in most of those situations where you need to get higher, Dixie would work just as well. And if you need a buddy for platforming, forget about it. Dixie is a better choice than Diddy in every single instance. Diddy's the same as he was in Returns, but Dixie not only flies upward, she also gets substantially more distance. Using the other Kongs was fun this time around, but yet I was often left saying to myself, should have been Dixie. The Dixie imbalance is made even worse by the new Kong Pao partner attacks, which build up as you collect bananas. You can use one to turn every enemy on screen into an item. It's a little superfluous, and I often forget to even use it, but Cranky and Diddy's Kong Pao turns enemies into banana coins and life balloons, items that are never in short supply. Dixie's Kong Pao turns enemies into not just hearts, but golden hearts that let you take twice as much damage. The solution to this could have gone a couple of different ways. I hesitate to nerf Dixie too much, since she's already such a joy to play as, so let's just make her Kong Pao give you regular hearts, and leave her alone mechanically. When you choose Cranky, you're giving up movement options that make platforming easier, but Cranky's cane bounce bizarrely doesn't protect you in certain cases where I think it should. If you let that cane bounce on anything, he'd be a better choice in more cases. But even as is, Cranky's in a pretty good place. No, the real problem here is Diddy. I don't know, man. Retro was hamstrung by the fact that they basically tacked Dixie's floaty jump onto Diddy back in Returns. So, hey, maybe we just go back to one of Rare's favorite tropes, and Diddy is Kong-napped by the Snowmads and held on DK Island. That'd make him seem like even more of a threat. Then you could unlock him at the end of the game, and he'd feel like a worthy bonus instead of a second banana. But this whole tangent is ultimately just a nitpick. Dixie being the optimal choice does nothing to rob Tropical Freeze of how much an improvement it is over an already spectacular predecessor. In the classic trilogy, carrying and throwing objects was a core part of the gameplay. Returns technically had throwable objects, but DK barrels aside, it was infrequent and out of focus. Tropical Freeze reintegrates it as a constant and critical mechanic, used for both attacking enemies and puzzle solving. But I'm only noticing this because I'm replaying it in close proximity to Returns. In 2014, I didn't even think twice about the fact that I could throw these enemies, because it's such a natural fit. But the biggest thing I didn't quite appreciate about Tropical Freeze back when it was released, the biggest improvement that was so subtle that I didn't even catch it, is that they fixed Returns' most substantial problem: its approach to level design. In Returns, levels were cluttered with breakable objects and blowable dandelions that gave you items, and there were so many of them, they tended to interrupt the flow of the game. Tropical Freeze does still have stuff like this, but they're spaced out and varied enough that they never feel like clutter. One part of the reason is that Tropical Freeze has replaced the clunky blowing mechanic from Returns with something way more fitting for the character: pulling. DK can use his enormous strength to activate switches, pluck throwables, and even alter the structure of the environment. So where Returns had clutter, Tropical Freeze has density. Every single beat of a level is designed around a particular objective, and sometimes laced with optional challenges that have you collecting a pattern of bananas, which will net you extra items or puzzle pieces. This means that while you can choose to stop and engage with whatever the game's presenting you with, overcoming it will come down to your reflexes and skill, instead of your ability to position your character and shake a Wii remote. What this translates to is that even if you decide to take the time to grab all the things, it won't break the flow of the gameplay. Now, the same sort of repetitive collect-em-all bonus stages are back. And when I made the video for Returns, this was something I was expecting to rail on, but it's not nearly the detriment that I thought it would be. It is a bit odd to walk out of a sky-high environment of floating balloons into yet another cave where you have to grab a bunch of items, but the bonus stages do mix things up better than Returns. And more importantly, it seems like most of Tropical Freeze's puzzle pieces are hidden within stages this time around. A lot of the time when I was expecting a bonus stage, I would just find the puzzle piece instead, and in fact that was more satisfying than being yanked onto a completely different screen. It would have been cool to have something more like DKC2's variety of bonus stages, but that approach would really demand something more substantial than puzzle pieces to be attached to them. One of Tropical Freeze's most obvious additions over Returns is literally one of the first things you do in the game. You come down this water slide and splash down into an underwater section. The classic DKC games, especially the first one, took the Mario approach when it came to their water levels. You press a button to paddle up, but you're totally defenseless. The game completely changes when you're off land, and while I'm sure the intention was to add some variety, the result is something much less mechanically interesting, or for that matter, fun. So where DKC1's water stages had a great ambience, if you'll excuse the term, they tended to be the most boring part of playing the game. This was mitigated somewhat by Enguard, and the sequels got better about using water as a stage hazard, but the point stands. The Mario approach tends to be the reason that everyone hates water levels, and so I was fine with them being omitted from Returns. In reintroducing them to Tropical Freeze, Retro did not take the Mario approach. No, the Kongs can now do what you'd actually expect them to be able to do in water. They can pivot their direction and swim in a manner that's much more fun and intuitive than just paddling upward. They also have a lengthy tornado spin attack with a really forgiving hitbox. This means that water is a mechanically different environment, but now it's actually a fun place to be. Weirdly, the Kongs also suddenly have an air meter. Which, you know, fair enough, but I didn't really find it to be much of an obstacle aside from a few dedicated water stages. And even then, air bubbles are so plentiful, I don't think I ever lost a heart to it. Time to pick at another nit, though. As soon as we found out the game would have water levels, it seemed like a given that Retro would address one of Return's most noticeable blemishes, and at the very least bring back Enguard. But no, once again, Rambi is the only animal buddy in the game. And while the much improved swimming mechanics alongside the variety that the different Kongs bring do soften that blow somewhat, how fun would it have been to rampage the sea with Enguard as a bombastic sort of aquatic version of Rambi? Especially when there's an entire boss that's fought underwater. God, I mean, even if Enguard had just made a cameo here to save you, it would have been awesome. But enough of what could have been. One more way that Tropical Freeze improves on Returns is in its approach to difficulty. The occasional hiccups of awkward, cheap level design are ironed out, yet the stages can be even more bombastic and challenging, and stage gimmicks are even more creative and well thought out. Particular praise here has to go to the K-Temple stages. I know some people take issue with the lack of checkpoints, but because it's confined to what are very clearly the challenge stages, this old school approach just clicks for me. Bobopolis is my pick for the most difficult level in this entire series. I spent almost an hour here, but I reached this sort of zen-like state. Forcing the player to boringly solve the same puzzles when they die is one thing, but forcing them to overcome challenges that in turn force them to play better is fine by me. There's something to be said about that repetition, about effortlessly overcoming something that used to give you pause, of mastering something that seemed so impossible. All that frustration is worth it. While the super guide is gone, Tropical Freeze's version of a difficulty slider feels a lot more respectful to the player as someone who wants to play the game. Funky takes Cranky's place as a shopkeep and stocks you with a bevy of useful items that can add extra hit points and even save you from pits. The vehicle stages are no longer one-hit KOs this time around. This alone makes the rocket barrel section so much more enjoyable, helped along by how friendly the game is with granting extra lives and hearts before difficult sections. And that difficulty, that epic scope, builds and builds until you hit Tropical Freeze's final world, Donkey Kong Island. Each stage is built around the aesthetic of one of Return's worlds, but the whole island is frozen, breaking apart beneath your feet. You can even catch glimpses of Return's set pieces in the background. There's one difference that does more than perhaps anything else in this game to help Tropical Freeze evoke the atmosphere of the original trilogy, and you've been hearing it this whole time. As awesome as it was to see that Dixie was back, I was even more thrilled when I learned that David Wise would be returning. The man most closely associated with giving the Super Nintendo trilogy its legendary soundtrack, free from the limitations of the Super Nintendo sound hardware. The result, no surprise, was one of the best soundtracks the industry has ever seen. Retro knew what they had in David Wise, and so music is much more integrated throughout. Nearly every stage features a dynamic soundtrack that changes depending on where you are, rising and falling with the action. This is no longer an aping of Wise's greatest hits. This is the man himself, and he brings so much more grandeur and authenticity with what Donkey Kong Country is. Sometimes the tone on DK Island is threatening and foreboding. The tenacity of this track makes it my favorite in the game. At other times, World 6 is more evocative of Diddy's conquest, the thrill and adrenaline rush and danger of charging into enemy territory. The difference here is that this is the Kong's home turf, corrupted into enemy territory. The tone in some of these stages make the frozen Donkey Kong Island one of the most melancholy places in the series. Returns re-establish that island as a place that the characters, and by extension the player, feel a connection with. Tropical Freeze is able to leverage that to make the player feel what a threat the Snowmads pose, by showing what's already been lost. This is exactly the kind of pathos that Return's own final world was missing, and it's carried through the whole game. There are improvements I haven't even mentioned yet. The map screens feel way more like DKC, featuring the characters moving around them instead of a giant rotating symbol. In Returns, you got to extra levels by buying a giant key that unlocked a gamey padlock, but every world in Tropical Freeze has a few hidden exits within stages, which can even lead to shortcuts through the map. From the controls, to the characters, to the level variety, to the stages, Retro fixed or at least polished nearly every single issue that anyone had with Returns, upped the ante in creativity and scope, and almost perfected what a modern Donkey Kong Country game should be. In fact, Tropical Freeze is such a near-perfect game, the few nitpicks that can be raised with it seem more noticeable than they probably should, and end up looking like missed opportunities. Stuff like this. If you're going to have the temerity to call a stage Bramble Scramble, then you'd better make sure it lives up to that pedigree. And like, it's a good stage, but it doesn't even have the right music, despite the fact that there is a remix of Sticker Brush Symphony on the soundtrack. Okay, this is just fanboy whining. Let's get into the bigger issues. The load times are a little ridiculous. It takes almost 40 seconds to get from the system menu to the title screen, and another minute on top of that to load the map screen and enter a level. Surprisingly lengthy loading is kind of just another Wii U problem, so I think Retro did the best they could with what they had to work with. In Returns, it was disappointing that you could only directly play as Diddy in multiplayer. Tropical Freeze does address this, but only to an extent. After you collect all the K-Temple relics, you'll unlock a bonus world, Secret Seclusion. It's 3 stages of whimsical ridiculousness, but at least it is 3 stages compared to Returns 1. Once you complete it, Hard Mode is unlocked. Every single stage and boss fight can be played in Hard Mode, and here's the kicker, you can choose any of the 4 Kongs to play as, any one of them. But Hard Mode is true to its name. The inherent coolness of playing as Cranky is gonna lose its appeal for most players when there are no checkpoints and you die in one hit. So Hard Mode helps, but given what a huge fan of DKC2 I am, it's ridiculous that in a game with both Diddy and Dixie, there's no way to really even see them on screen at the same time. And how about the bosses? Last time I waxed on about Retro's modern approach to longer bosses, but Returns failed to make those long fights interesting. Tropical Freeze's bosses are not only better designed characters, they keep things fresher by varying their attacks, adding a new wrinkle to their patterns every time you master one, and they're all a blast to fight this time around. But I did say I was nitpicking, so here's the thing. The Snowmads have no backstory of their own. It's never really clear why they're attacking DK Island, although the inherent magical power of the Banana Horde is even more overtly confirmed here than it was in Returns. But still, it's unclear who the Snowmads are, where they came from, or how they even know about the Banana Horde. The leader of the Snowmads was only ever seen in silhouette, from the opening cutscene to the manual to even promotional material. And when you finally hit the apex of DK Island, this mysterious enemy that's been built up ever since the game was announced is revealed as a big walrus named Lord Frederick. And look, this is still awesome. His boss fight isn't that hard, but it has some really fun gimmicks. He's animated and lively, he comes across like an unhinged madman who only barely has a handle on what he's doing, yet that insanity is what makes him such an incredibly intimidating threat. Does that description remind you of anyone? Lord Frederick should have just been K. Rool. He disguised himself and spent a decade building his forces. He recruited the Snowmads. He discovered this ridiculous weather-controlling air horn that shoots ice dragons, and he used all that to finally try to exact vengeance on the Kongs. Even if it was only something that the game revealed as a stinger after the end credits, it just would have made way too much sense. Maybe Retro was just saving the Kremlings for their next game, for the third and final part of the Returns trilogy. You know, I've spent years thinking of Tropical Freeze as the second part of the Returns trilogy. Like, that phrase just rolls off the tongue. Maybe it's because of these little nitpicks. Maybe it still feels like Retro has unfinished business with Donkey Kong. But I fear that their fandom's icy reception to this game may have scared Nintendo away from putting this kind of effort behind a Donkey Kong game again. As time goes on, a trilogy seems less and less likely. Tropical Freeze is kind of a summation of the Wii U itself. It was a victim of confused, unfocused marketing, and it launched in an unfortunate climate. Its achievements went overlooked and unappreciated in its own time. Yet it refines the modern magic of Returns with even more imagination and creativity, and refines it to an almost perfect purity. I said last time, nothing's gonna eclipse my childhood nostalgia for the classics, but if I'm trying to be as objective as possible, I believe that Tropical Freeze is every bit as good as Donkey Kong Country 2, and in a lot of ways it's even better. It's a tour de force of mixing classic design principles with avant-garde creativity, and it should have raised the bar for 2D platformers. It's just too bad that Nintendo fans didn't see it that way. No, stop, I can't leave it there. Now that we're a few years removed from the sting of another damn Donkey Kong, and with Nintendo on sturdier ground again, Tropical Freeze is seeing sort of a renaissance of appreciation. I can't go anywhere in Nintendo fandom these days without seeing threads where somebody's just now discovering how awesome Tropical Freeze is for the first time, and it's even getting some newfound critical analysis. This doesn't change the fact that it was a niche game on a niche console, and, well, there's a part of me that cringes whenever I see people saying something like, they should bring every Wii U game that I wanted to play to the Switch, while in the same breath going, I never got a Wii U, I sure did dodge a bullet there. Like, if there were that many games you wanted to play, why didn't you just buy one? But then I remind myself that the Wii U gained its reputation for a lot of good reasons. And while the system had a ton of hidden gems, few were more unappreciated or overlooked than this one. Few would be more deserving of being ported to the Switch. Not just because I would love to play it on the go with more reasonable loading times, but much more importantly, because finally, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze could find the audience that it's always deserved. The worst thing a game can be is disappointing. If a game sucks, and the only reason you even know it exists is because of how bad it sucks, that's funny. If a game sucks and you saw it coming from a mile away and knew it was gonna suck, that's forgivable. But when you are affected by hype, when you spend weeks, months, even years in some cases, counting down the days to the release of a game that seems utterly destined to be one of your favorite games ever made, and it finally comes out, and whatever it is betrays those expectations, that's when it feels personal. It's not personal, of course. Maybe the development was rushed or under-budgeted. Maybe the studio punted on a bad game to make a deadline. Or maybe they were just targeting a new demographic, or experimenting with a different direction. Maybe it just wasn't for you this time, and that should be okay, right? There'll always be other games to play. But it can sure feel personal, especially if you haven't been through it a few times before. It's like the first cut is the deepest, you know? Let me tell you about my first cut. And to do that, I'm gonna need to tell you about a time when me, my similarly aged family members, my friends, we were all just completely and utterly obsessed with Donkey Kong Country. We had just spent 6 grueling months grinding our own lack of skill against DKC2's seemingly insurmountable difficulty curve, and by the time I had gotten to the other side of that mountain, I would never doubt how good I could get again. We then barreled through the first DKC in a matter of days, and we loved it too, but it hadn't lasted us like DKC2 had. We were too good for our own good, and we were craving for more. So, a direct sequel was in the cards, right? We had 3 Sonics, 3 Marios, 3 Contras, and 682 billion Mega Mans. A third Donkey Kong Country might happen. We definitely wanted it to happen, but there was just no way to know for sure. Until one day, on a whim, I decided to try something. What if I looked on the internet? What if I went to AOL keyword Nintendo and searched for the exact title of a game I wasn't even sure existed? I typed in Donkey Kong Country 3. And there it was. This was before it was revealed in Nintendo Power, before any magazine could go to print with it. This was the first time I ever found out about a new video game on the internet. And not a lot of people had the internet. I immediately burst out of the house and ran down the street to tell the other neighborhood kids, "Guys, it's true! It's happening! This will be a trilogy, and it'll be out in November!" And everybody was like, "Oh, cool. But Mario 64 is going to be out by then." Yep, they were right. By the time Donkey Kong Country 3 arrived, we were already spoiled on the next gen. The industry was hitting a transformative point like nothing we had ever seen before, and honestly like nothing we've seen since. The gulf was so wide between the 16-bit consoles we had known and loved, and the new 3D powerhouses, that a game on the previous gen was old-fashioned before it even came out. I mean, I was having 64-bit dreams like everyone else, but I was still trembling with hype for one more big Donkey Kong Country. I loved this series. I loved these characters. I loved these games. And I just knew this was going to be the perfect send-off for the 16-bit era. And when it finally got here, I played it for a few weeks with increasing indifference, saw the credits one time, and dropped it without ever even finding the Lost World. I would spend the next several years largely ignoring my old 16-bit systems, but even when I got a little older and discovered, whoa, these games are still awesome, and uh-oh, gaming might have actually lost something I really liked about it in the transition to 3D. Even when I had hit the point where I would replay the first two Donkey Kong Countries a few times a year, this one just never hit the same. The first two games became untouchable legends in my mind, buoyed by fond childhood memories with childhood friends, by decades of replays and reverence. Donkey Kong Country 3 was just the other one. It was just fine. But I didn't want fine. I wanted a game that lived up to Donkey Kong Country 2, that was even possibly better than that. What I got was disappointment. So much so that 19 years later, I was still holding on to that disappointment. And maybe some of this sounds familiar to you, because 19 years later, I was struggling to make an episode for this very channel about Donkey Kong Country 3. And I do mean I struggled. Something had gone wrong in the writing process, and I didn't understand what. I spent almost a month just hammering away at that script, tweaking it and revising it and letting friends read over it, trying to find the answer, but I never did find it. I think I figured it out now, and I'd like to try again. But don't worry, watching that old episode is not a prerequisite for watching this one. I mean, you can watch it if you want to, I'm not ashamed of it, I'm not gonna take it down. What I'm doing here isn't like a replacement. Just view the old episode as, you know, a snapshot of where I was 7 years ago. 7 years exactly. Let's see how far we've come. Let's get re-critiquing. Maybe it's best to start with a question. I think it's fair to say that this game is in the shadow of its predecessors, so setting my own experiences aside, why is that? Donkey Kong Country turned the tide in Nintendo's favor in the 16-bit war, established Rare as their right hand, and is held to this day as one of the definitive Super NES games. Donkey Kong Country 2 is way more than a superior sequel, it's a bona fide classic, regularly cited as one of the finest platformers ever made. Donkey Kong Country 3 is, like I said, the other one. And I don't think it's all down to timing. I don't think it's just because of when it came out. That explains why it flew under the radar 25 years ago, but that's happened to plenty of late-generation games. Here's another sequel that got totally overshadowed and overlooked when it came out. Nobody was paying any attention to Majora's Mask in the year 2000, but now it's seen as a cult classic, and even described by some as the best in the series. But even with decades of hindsight, DKC3 usually isn't talked about in the same reverent tones. So why is that? I think there's a case to be made that Donkey Kong Country 3 makes not a bad first impression, but that it maybe doesn't put its best foot forward. Some of the things that really make it special aren't particularly obvious until you get a little ways into it. Let's start with the story. DK and Diddy have disappeared, with no explanation beyond going to explore the Northern Islands, and that they'll be back tomorrow. And they didn't even ask Dixie to go with them. A day passes, and then another. And finally, Dixie takes the initiative and sets out to find them. She's barely hopped off of DK Island when she runs into Wrinkly, who says the boys did pass through, but didn't say where they were going. Huh. Then she runs into Funky, who says, "I'm a dude!" Okay, it's been a long time, I had to get that one in. Funky still rules. He lets her borrow a motorboat so she can explore the Western Islands. This is an early clue to how different DKC3 is going to be. DKC1, the Kremlings invaded our home and stole the banana horde. DKC2, the Kremlings have captured Donkey Kong. DKC3, our boyfriend and his pal haven't come back yet. It gives some context to why the game starts off so low-key and laid back. There's cause for concern, but maybe not for worry. Not yet. In contrast to every other game released back then, and most games released now, there's no real crisis to the inciting incident. And I imagine this was intentional. The previous game soared so high and ended so emphatically, so maybe we start with a mystery this time, something a little more laid back, and ratchet up the stakes later. If that was the intent, then this is an intriguing hook, as long as you have the instruction manual. Because if you don't, or if you just think you're too cool to freaking read, I remember you, Thomas, from 2nd grade! If you don't have the instruction manual, then all you're gonna see is Dixie leap into the water, swim to shore, and meet up with Wrinkly, who says not a word about Donkey and Diddy. She just introduces herself to the player and tells you how to save the game. It's not at all unusual that a game's story in this era would be contained entirely to the manual, but it is odd that this breaks the series' precedent. Both of the previous games did a better job setting up at least a piece of their stories in-game, and they didn't even have a mandatory cutscene at the start. But saying the game fails to put its best foot forward, I don't just mean the story, and I don't even just mean the first level. Although, yeah, Lakeside Limbo is pretty The Animal Buddy section is over so fast that, oh, I'm already at the end of it. But no, I am unfortunately saying that the entire opening act, let's call it the first 2 worlds really, are when DKC3 is at its weakest. This island right here, comprising Lake Orangatanga and Crimwood Forest. Level 2, Doorstop Dash, premieres the Mill theme, and these are hands down bar none the ugliest stages in the trilogy. There's little color variation, the background lacks depth with the foreground, and whole chunks of unique levels can look almost identical. So of course, there are 3 of them! And they all come in the first 2 worlds. But what bugs me more than how they look is how they're designed. Just like the previous 2 games, and just like nearly every platformer in existence, DKC3 pulls from the Mario playbook in its approach to level design. But I would argue perhaps that DKC3 pulls from it a little more often. A stage will introduce a new gimmick, like, for example, bazooka-wielding owls who fire projectiles at you from the background. Then, it'll test the player in a variety of iterations on that gimmick, mixing and matching it with different layouts and challenges to create a sort of inter-level difficulty curve. When the stage ends, the gimmick is discarded, and we move on to something new. Not every stage does this, but most of them rely on it at least to some degree. And why not? It's tried and true platformer design. Gimmick is not a bad word, and DKC3 is going to have some good ones. But in Doorstop Dash, the gimmick is that you have to pull down switches to open doors, which close if you take too long. That's a tough formula to get right at the best of times. And this is only the 2nd stage, so it can't really do anything too complex with the idea. Just 2 levels later, we're back in the mill, and this one, if anything, has the opposite problem. Where Doorstop Dash was under-designed, Murky Mill is overly complex. It's the first level built around an animal buddy, Ellie the elephant, and utilizes one of her unique attributes. The mill is patrolled by mice called sneaks, and if Ellie sees one, she gets spooked. The stage is largely cast in darkness, peppered with swinging, scattered spotlights. It has a degree of atmosphere that the other mills lack. And I have to give credit to Evelyn Novakovic's score here. The pitter-patter percussion perfectly punctuates those rats, scattering unseen somewhere in the walls. But if you've played the previous games, it seems almost intentionally designed to drive a comparison to Rambi. Rambi was awesome, effortless fun. He could charge through hordes of enemies just by moving forward, and he's nowhere to be found in DKC3. Instead, we get Ellie, who, given how truncated this was, is making her first real impression here, in a level built around an attribute of hers. It's not something the player can control. It's not some unique move or ability that makes her more fun or more interesting to play. It's just that she'll run away if she sees a sneak in the light. And if this level could have come when the player was more familiar with the full extent of what Ellie can do, that might have worked. But as it is, Murky Mill is a level where you carry infinitely respawning barrels from section to section, sniping enemies from the darkness. If you miss or otherwise lose the barrel, you just gotta backtrack and do it again. I've played it so much now that it's over with before I know it, but man, I used to dread this one. And I can see a newcomer bouncing off the game right here. But I'm really hyper-focusing on the negatives here. The early game isn't bad, it's just not as good as it will be. But there are still some highlights. Skidda's Row is a straightforward level with no particular gimmick beyond rolling snowbanks, and snow just so happens to be one of my top 2 level themes. It's fun to compare this to the original Donkey Kong Country, and see how far Rare's AC and rendering prowess had come. Speaking of which, I don't think DKC3's take on the forest theme comes out quite as well visually, but I do love the creativity on display, weaving between branches in a system of enormous hollowed-out trees. It had become a bit of a recurring theme for Rare. Despite how incredibly high above the canopy the Kongs must be, the underbrush is too thick for pits, as the score is taking an over-the-top mid-90s video game trope and giving it just the right amount of off-kilter tension. The first level of Crimwood Forest is called Barrel Shield Bust Up, and besides just being a lot of fun to say, it's an example of a dedicated gimmick done right. Introduce the concept safely, and then ratchet up the difficulty through iteration. And for obvious reasons, Riverside Race has always been one of my favorites. Bees chase you, you have no choice but to run as fast as possible, and if you do it fast enough, you make a bear so mad that he loses his mind. Truly, this is what video games are supposed to be. But for every level like that in the first 2 worlds, it seems like there's a tidal trouble, which spends entirely too much of its runtime confining you to the lower third of the screen and a current that's pushing you the wrong way. Or spring and spiders. Despite their appearance, they can't actually hurt you, so the level's just about making awkward precision jumps on tiny moving platforms. This trilogy struggles sometimes with verticality, doesn't it? And then we got god-dang Squeals on Wheels, the third and mercifully the final mill level. We still have to carry a never-ending supply of steel drums to kill a never-ending supply of sneaks, but at least we don't have to do it as a scaredy cat elephant this time. +1 for that. Minus several million because we do have to kill every single sneak in the level to open a door that's back on the start. At least crashing through the trapdoors to get back there is fun. Oh, and Perry the Parallel Bird is in it. He's the best. So yeah, it's not that DKC3 makes a poor first impression, it just doesn't put its best foot forward. And first impressions matter. Miyamoto himself said that the first 30 minutes of a game are the most important. If you fail to invest a player, you may never get him back. And as endless and all-encompassing as everyone's backlog is nowadays, I can see why a player, even a player that enjoyed DKC2, might drop off before they ever get this far. To this point, DKC3 just seems less than. And this brings us to the final stage of the second world, Bobbing Barrel Brawl. Another level built entirely around Ellie. When my cousin and I first got here in '96, I think our eyes rolled out of our heads. Nobody wants to play as this stupid elephant, we whined. Where's Rambi? Why'd they get rid of Rambi? Animal buddies are such an iconic part of the trilogy, and there's a reason it was so disappointing when the Returns games failed to feature any of them besides Rambi. They offer unique gameplay from the Kongs, allowing for distinct challenges and set pieces crafted with their abilities in mind. And full credit goes to Transparency for what I'm about to say. Actually, really, for everything I've said. Alicia and Kiki do awesome work, and while I had been thinking of doing this for a while, their video was what really pushed me over the edge. You both rule, thank you. So to coin their phrase, the best animal buddies are so mechanically robust and fun to play, you could make an entire game around them. And first impressions be damned, Ellie is one of the best. Bobbing Barrel Brawl turns out to be the cure to Murky Mill's disease. Where that level makes you work around something that's out of your control, this one properly introduces Ellie's unique abilities and lets the player utilize them and experiment with them in interesting, well-designed challenges. She can pull barrels in with her trunk and drop them in the river to make stepping stones. Once she's down there, she can suck up a limited amount of water and use it as a projectile to blast enemies in multiple directions. She cannot dive underwater and automatically rises, which is put to creative use for one of the coolest bonus barrel entries in the game. And later on, her weight even lets her flatten enemies that Dixie can't handle. So Bobbing Barrel Brawl isn't just another gimmicky level, it is the exact point that Donkey Kong Country 3 finally gets out of the gate and starts firing on all cylinders. When you beat the boss of Grimwood Forest, you get some kind of band-aid thing. Oh, I know that! From off of the title screen! Take it back to Funky, and trade that dinky motorboat in for a hovercraft. To this point, this has been the extent of how far you've been able to go on the world map, but now we can push further into the great unknown. I bet there'll be more Donkey Kong Country levels out there. Where the first two games each took place on a single island, Dixie's adventure takes place across a whole archipelago, an alpine region called the Northern Cremisphere. And where before the map screen was a linear A to B progression of levels within worlds, DKC3's overworld is more open-ended, incentivizing a little exploration, a little backtracking, and lending the game a far greater sense of scale. And nothing sells the difference better than the moment you hop those rocks for the first time, and you get a choice of where you'd like to go next. The waterfall basin of Cotton Top Cove, or the industrialized island of Mechanos. You're even completely free to swap between them if you get stuck. And whichever way you go, you'll start with a level set in a brand new archetype, built around an excellently executed gimmick. That level of quality is pretty much standard operating procedure for the rest of the game. I don't want to say every level from now on knocks it out of the park, there are still a handful of clunkers, but they don't strike out often. It's like I said earlier, gimmick is not a bad word. And when I made the original episode, I kinda treated it like it was. By doing that, I was sweeping some important considerations under the rug. For starters, Donkey Kong Country 1 and especially 2 both had plenty of gimmicky stages themselves, and not all of them were exactly the picture of perfection either. Though there was a time when I dared not criticize the majesty of Diddy's conquest. I honestly don't think stages like Glimmer's Galleon or Red Hot Ride are all that fun. But you gotta have some ebb and flow in your game progression, right? Even the best game in the world would get boring if it was all one flavor. And DKC3 really isn't that much different. Are there a few stages here and there where you move endlessly respawning barrels around to solve light puzzles? Sure. They're kinda stinky. Is there a water level where you have to make sure you're feeding a fish enemies he likes and not ones he doesn't, and if he gets too mad, he'll chomp you? Yes! And it's great. But there are a whole lot more levels like Skidda's Row, Crevice Creepers, Coindozer Clamber, these fast-paced, challenging, kinetic stages that offer inventive challenges that iterate and do not obfuscate the core gameplay. And real talk, gimmicks are not, that is most of the game. But I also enjoy a lot of the levels that do offer a different flavor, like Low G Labyrinth. We know from the previous game that red gas slows you down, blue gas freezes you, and purple gas reverses your controls. I guess green gas lowers gravity somehow. In any case, I came back to this one constantly when I was little. I think I just love the unique twist on the mechanics, the moon physics. You move much slower, but jump much higher. And keeping in line with this aesthetic, I also want to give a shout out to Poison Pipeline, the penultimate level of the game. You know how purple gas reverses your controls? Yeah, this is a stage where left and right are reversed when you're in the liquid, and I love it. I think playing this at such a young age gave me an edge with any other game that wants to screw with your controls. Both of these stages are great examples of a slower paced level that's still fun and challenging, that still reaps the rewards of its gimmick. Animal transformation barrels were introduced back in DKC2, and it's easy to see why they became so ubiquitous. If you want to design a stage around an animal buddy, you'd best not be able to lose that animal buddy. Pothole Panic goes in the opposite direction, featuring 4 different rideable animals and requiring you to hop off and swap between them. It puts them all to excellent use. I remember back when I was working on the original episode, this stage was the exact point where I started to realize, maybe I'm in trouble. Maybe I've gotten this all wrong. But if you want me to name my favorite archetype in the game, and one of my favorites in the whole trilogy, this is it. Donkey Kong Country 3's waterfall stages feature some incredible aesthetic touches. The transparency effects on the falls themselves are gorgeous, and the sound effects gain a wide-range echo effect, helping you feel how high up in the mountains you are. The level design incorporates multiple layers, weaving from the background to the foreground. There's an Ellie stage in this style that make Bobbing Barrel Brawl look like joke, and the contrast between serenity and danger in the music perfectly resonates with the game's theme. It's just awesome stuff. Oh, and in one of those weird little touches that tend to show up in retro games, you know those throwable crates that were all over DKC2? One of them somehow made it to the Northern Hemisphere. Just one. This is the only crate in the game. Much has been made of the DKC trilogy's graphics over the years, and the whole pre-rendered craze they kicked off in the mid to late 90s. For the record, I still think they look incredible, all the more for how early this was in 3D tech, but they hold up a lot better on a big bad chunky boy tube TV. Oh yeah, the capacitors in my CRT went bad between the time that I scripted this and recorded it. I found out literally yesterday. I just turned it on and it was like this. I'm really sad about it. Gonna have to find myself a new Trinitron. Anyway, this is the display technology they were made for, a fact that's far more obvious with a game like this than most other retro titles. Blow an old pixel art game up to high definition, and maybe it's not the exact look the artists had in mind, but they don't look bad at all. Those pixels are razor sharp. Do the same thing to a pre-rendered game though, and you've exposed the trick for what it is. Snapshots of full 3D models, scaled down, way down, to something the Super NES can manage. It's like when you shrink a high-res image in Photoshop and then blow it back up again. And this might be even more apparent with DKC3, whose color palette is generally brighter and more vibrant than either of its predecessors. Those darker tones in the previous games left a lot of room for imperfections to hide, for your imagination to fill in the blanks. Even on a modern display though, I find it easy enough to get lost in the game's aesthetic. I don't really notice this stuff unless I'm looking for it. Actually, as a whole, I still think this art style has a lot of untapped retro charm. It's so high contrast, so specific to its era. Games had never looked like this before. They would never look like this again. But for just a few years, it was the peak of cutting edge. But then it's easy enough for me to remember what it was like in 1996, seeing it for the first time via god-awful RF cables on a 13-inch CRT. Donkey Kong Country 3 was one of the prettiest games I had ever seen. That more vibrant palette was just another aspect of its identity, setting it apart from the others. Even having played Mario 64, DKC3 still impressed me. And honestly, it still impresses me now. The environments tend to get a lot of focus, and deservedly so, but as I'm going through my footage, I'm really noticing the character animation. The amount of frames on Dixie's jump alone, the way the animation commits to and follows the action, and even how well it reflects Dixie's character. Rare's skill with ACM rendering was absolutely unparalleled. The rest of the industry was still years away from replicating this, and generations away from being able to do it in real time. And right here, I just noticed while I was editing this, the floor is reflecting the electricity. Who knew? The Super NES had ray tracing! If we take a snapshot of the three DKC titles, released in November of 3 consecutive years, they form a tapestry of how quickly the industry was changing in that time. Donkey Kong Country comes out in 1994 as a pure action platformer with challenge as its primary incentive. Completion is present, technically, but it feels a little tertiary. The bonus rooms aren't tied to any tangible reward, aside from a higher percentage on your save file, and a few different lines from Cranky at the end of the game. Come 1995, 16-bit is having its final year in the spotlight, and pushing toward the future. DKC2 has loads more collectibles and secrets to uncover, and collecting coins and bonus areas leads you to an entire hidden world, containing the most challenging levels and the golden ending. Jump to 1996, and that brave new world isn't just a dream anymore. Games are getting bigger, deeper, heavier, and more complex. Non-linear design and actual in-game storytelling is becoming eminently more possible. Completion, and the incentives that come with it, are starting to take more of a priority. And so Dixie's game reflects the moment. And as much as anything else, maybe that's a reason that it didn't gel with me as much. It's sort of the same reason that by the time I was in middle school a few years later, I was already talking about how different things were back in the good old days. I found that the sorts of games that people told me I wasn't supposed to like because the graphics suck, or they're too 2D, or too hard, or too outdated, games like this were, in fact, often the ones I liked best. I felt increasingly like there was something missing from Not all modern games, but many of them. Something which I couldn't quite identify, but which I knew could be found in spades back before games got so fancy. I was already sinking as much time into retro games as I was new ones. Often I was playing them more, going back and discovering games I'd been too young for, and rediscovering my old favorites from the perspective of a slightly older person. It's weird to think that I was so wistful for the long ago days of, like, 3 years earlier, but the industry had changed completely in such a short time. And while I can look back on that and see that a part of it was just me reaching the end of my childhood and already looking back with rose-colored glasses, I never really completely stopped feeling that way. I've said it 682 billion times here, I'm not a completionist. What that means is, I don't enjoy elements of games that feel like busy work or padding. Because I lack much inherent enjoyment of completion for its own sake, it's usually easy for me to get awfully impatient if a game's unskippable walking cutscenes, or endless side quests, or really any amount of unnecessary fluff is keeping me from the good part. I really just want to be free to experience and experiment with the game mechanics, and I place an extremely high value on replay value. It's the reason a lot of modern AAAs don't hold my interest, but I do, to put it mildly, have a lot more patience than I used to. You know, that's true. Actually, I really do have a lot more patience with games than I used to. While I've been working on this episode, I've almost beaten Earthbound. I'm very close to the end, and, like, for years I thought that game was just going to be something that I sort of appreciated from a distance. I respect it, but it wasn't for me. But apparently it's for me now. And yeah, I don't even want to talk about how many hours I've put into Tokimeki Memorial. That's not actually that bad. If you approach it with a completionist's mindset, Donkey Kong Country 3 is probably the most rewarding game in the trilogy. For starters, the completion system itself is a lot more straightforward. In previous games, any number of bonus rooms could be hidden in a level. Some of them even had no bonus rooms. But in DKC 3, each stage comes with 2. One before the halfway barrel, one after. The way they're hidden strikes the right balance, asking you to notice something out of place within a level, or cleverly using enemy design without feeling cheap. And the challenge rooms themselves turn those unique stage gimmicks into a major strength, shrinking them down into bite-sized, focused chunks that are both fun and rewarding to overcome. My absolute favorite example of this comes in Crackshot Croc, a squitter stage where a Kremling fires at you from behind the fourth wall while you frantically skitter across webs. It's good stuff. But in this bonus level, you take control of the crosshair. You get to blast every last Kremling off the map. You get caught up in the crossfire. And this one little bonus room is the only time it happens. Man, why'd they have to stop making Super NES games? This is so cool! You know what else is cool? Bears! The Brothers Bear basically bear the burden of being a fetch quest. They're a troop of friendly, mostly friendly, NPCs spread across the Northern Hemisphere. They're basically here to incentivize exploration and backtracking on the map screen. But in rare tradition, this aspect of game design is represented through individual characters. As a character design, they're sort of the predecessor to Banjo. In terms of gameplay function, they're a predecessor to Banjo-Kazooie's mindless idiots who ask for your help. We call them that with affection. One of them wants to trade an absurd amount of bear coins for useless information. One of them is Blue, literally, figuratively, and nomenclatively, because he thinks everyone forgot his birthday, and you gotta cheer him up by bringing him a present. One of them is a retired general who fought in the Crimean War, and wants nothing more than to fire off old Bessie one more time. So you load her up with a bowling ball, which was the present you gave to Blue, which came from Blizzard. A pair of twins named Benny and Bjorn operate chairlifts in Razor Ridge. Bjorn means bear in Scandinavian languages. This guy's name is Bear Bear. I mean, this guy's name is also Bear Bear, but maybe I'll make that video in another 7 years. Bjorn's chairlift is broken, so you gotta bring him his wrench. If you give it back to him, he'll let you ride the lift from then on. But if you have it, and you refuse even once to give it back to him, he holds a permanent grudge. Even if you decide to give it back later, he will charge you 2 bear coins for the privilege forevermore. I love when a game has these offbeat little flourishes that most players will never even see. But it's probably time to address the elephant in the room. No, I already talked about her. Seriously, you've probably noticed I've conspicuously avoided something until now. I know you're all probably wondering when it's gonna come up and why it hasn't yet. So, I'm ready. Let's get this out of the way.
Which Brothers Bear is best? Which Brothers Bear is best? Which Brothers Bear
Barry's best. Which brother's Barry's best? Which brother's Barry's best? Which brother's Barry's best? Which brother's Barry's best? Which brother's Barry's best?
Brash! Brash is the best Brothers Bear! I mean, he's obnoxiously proud of his mediocre speedrun of Riverside Race, and when you wipe the floor with him, he reacts exactly how you'd want him to. Like I said earlier, poning noobs who aren't as good as you is what video games are all about. Brash is the kind of ass clown who gets mad when a game doesn't have cabbage physics. I love him!
This Brothers Bear is best.
The Brothers Bear are a lot of fun. It's cool that a region unexplored by the Kongs has actual sentient characters living there that we've never met before. And yeah, they're just a cute little way to get the player to explore the map. As characters, they're pretty one note. You kind of have to take a very good faith approach, and have an eagerness to not just read, but extrapolate between the lines to appreciate them on any deeper level than that. You have to be a fan, in other words. I am, and I do, but I'm self-aware of that fact. So I don't want to oversell this. All this incentive for exploration amounts to is finding these caves where you play a Simon-style minigame to collect banana birds. Yeah, you tell him, Cranky. Even swapping items between bears most often just leads to more banana birds. Heck, there's only one time in the game where you even get to choose between two worlds, and as well as it works here, I have no idea why they didn't do it again later. But, to its great credit, the Game Boy Advance remake does do it again later. Not only can you choose between K3 or Razor Ridge later on, you can also head to the other side of the map and go to Pacifica, a whole new world exclusive to the remake. Those are some creative levels that mash up tropes we never saw in the original. I think this remake flew under a lot of radars. I mean, in 2005, we got brand new Donkey Kong Country levels created by Rare. And just like the original release was overshadowed by the next-gen consoles, the remake got overlooked because the DS and PSP were out. History rhymes sometimes. Anyway, the point is, this is by no means some early attempt at an open-world game. It's just an open-ended map screen in a mid-90s 2D platformer. But on the other hand, it's an open-ended map screen in a mid-90s 2D platformer. Hubworlds were already codified as a mainstay of 3D platformers, but I have trouble thinking of more than a handful of games in the 2D genre that do that even now. The ambition on display, the unique presentation of the region, and the amount of time you spend in it makes it absolutely integral to DKC3's identity. Let me put it like this. When I think of DKC1, the first place my mind goes is the jungle. When I think of DKC2, it's probably the brambles. But when I think of DKC3, I don't think of any particular stage archetype. My mind goes to the Northern Hemisphere itself, this gorgeous archipelago, with music so enchanting and dangerous and adventurous, you can almost taste the crispness of the air. Actually, the juxtaposition between Cotton Top Cove and Mechanos is one of the most direct instances of the game tipping off its theme. One world is an alpine paradise with enchanted riverbanks, deep-sea diving, and waterfalls cascading down mountains. The other is an industrialized, polluted mess of dimly lit steel tunnels and dark refineries headed up by an unseen new threat. So let's talk about that new threat. Let's talk about Chaos, a mysterious enemy who's positioned as the game's antagonist. He's named on the box, but conspicuously, he's not shown anywhere. Conceptually, that's really cool, especially when you run into him for the first time a lot earlier than you'd expect. Chaos is the boss of the fourth war. Okay, it depends on your choices. As the boss of Mechanos. And come to think of it, considering this is all of the map you can see at this point, I guess a new player might think they're at the end of the game here. But just like DKC3 fails to set up its story in-game, I don't exactly think it nails the payoff either. Chaos turns out to be a giant robot that looks like something straight out of 1930s sci-fi. Or Mystery Science Theater. Just a conglomeration of parts. His initial design has a SWAT bot head, which lifts away to reveal a robot dude! And then one final head that has googly eyes and shoots out bombs. It's at least in line with DKC3's whole old-school horror film enemy aesthetic, although most of the time it leans more toward monster movies than sci-fi, but whatever. The issue I have with Chaos is more related to, there is no good way to say this, his brain. In the very last scene of the main game, it's revealed that, gasp, K. Rool was behind everything the whole time! He captured Donkey and Diddy and used their brain energy to power Chaos. Yeah, this is lame. For one thing, it's a repeat of DKC2. Donkey Kong was captured there, both DK and Diddy are captured here. For 2, it's not remotely clear why K. Rool needed them specifically to power his killer robot. He's been a king and a captain. What is he, K. Rool Botnik now? For 3, I just don't think I like the idea of DK and Diddy being captured and subjugated like this. If you'll indulge me in fantasy booking, what if DK and Diddy were out there the whole time, taking a completely different, unseen path through the Northern Hemisphere? What if Dixie finally caught up with them in the end? If the finale of the trilogy saw the heroes of all 3 games team up to take down K. Rool? Ah well, journey not the destination. The boss fight itself is probably the weakest of the 3 K. Rool duels, but it's still fun. This is probably pretty obvious by now, but I've gained an exponential amount of respect and appreciation for Eveline Novakovic's soundtrack. Yeah, I still don't care for Lakeside Limbo as an opening level, but let's give it the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it works as a bouncy contrast with the wide-sweeping overworld theme. In any case, that's really the only stage theme I have an issue with. The rest is, bare minimum, great stuff. Take, for instance, DKC3's water levels. This is some of the most chilling ambience in the series. And I use that word ambience with intent. If David Wise's music in the original game was about emphasizing the calm serenity of the ocean, then Eveline Novakovic's is about reminding us of its vastness, its breathtaking terror, and of how utterly small and lost we primates would be in it. And not in spite of, but because of DKC3's focus on gimmicks, these are bar none the best deep sea levels in the trilogy. Since I brought up the comparison anyway, I think this is what David Wise's replacement score from the GBA version misses sometimes. Instead of Eveline's terrifyingly beautiful water world, we get David's heart-wrenchingly gorgeous remix of his own aquatic ambience. Yeah, the new soundtrack still has some incredible stuff, even if it is crunched through the GBA's lack of sound hardware. But it's great in the same way Wise's music is always great. Actually, it reminds me more than anything else of his more recent work on Tropical Freeze, and that's never a bad thing. But while on one hand this means the GBA score carries more resonance as part of the series, it may also undermine DKC3's unique identity within it. But at worst, it just gives the game a different flavor. It's all a matter of taste. Really, the few areas where the original soundtrack stumbles comes down to an issue of placement, not composition. Take the final boss music. This song's okay when you're fighting chaos, but I really wish something more bombastic and less repetitive had kicked in when K. Rool revealed himself. And after you beat him, this track fits great for the goofy little scene that plays out, but then it restarts and plays for 8.5 minutes through the entire character parade. The first 2 games both used a tune with more variation and introspection for this, like you're at the end of a long, arduous journey and you've earned the victory lap. This one's just like, you're done, I guess. But hang on, you're not done. It's 1996. Games can't just end at the credits. We've still got a whole nother world to go. The way you actually get into the Lost World this time is pretty creative. You have to circle this rock formation 3 times at top speed. But this isn't just a ploy to sell strategy guides. One of the Brothers Bear drops increasingly direct hints about how to do it every time you visit him. But if you so happen to figure this out without his help, he breaks the 4th wall and calls you out. You know, I think Rare style might be where my lifelong fascination with media being meta got its start. It was either that or Grover. DKC2's Lost World was loaded with ideas even wilder and more challenging than the rest of the game. And you know, the sentence I originally wrote here was, DKC3 continues this tradition. But then I played it again and realized I'd fallen prey to sequence bias. Krematoa starts off strong. As an indication of how far we've come, Stampede Sprint takes that whole Ellie is afraid of mice thing and runs with it, creating a level that's actually fun this time. And it ends on a high note. Rocket Rush is a tough-as-nails stage completely unlike anything else in the series. I like it when games get unfair at the end, what are you gonna do? But everything between those two is, forgettable enough that I forgot about it apparently. It's also unfortunate that the Lost World doesn't have a stage archetype unique to it, something to set it apart the way that DKC2's Jungles did for its Lost World. Although, come to think of it, the final world of the main game didn't have any new archetypes either, and those all ruled. Speaking of, the true final boss is a rematch with K. Rool, and unfortunately, the second verse is worse than the first. It tries to do something different by having him move to the background, requiring you to throw barrels upward into a vacuum tube that comes down on him, I guess? Yeah, Yoshi's Island did it better. When you beat him, he just calmly flies into the background and rotates back there. Presumably forever. And then the victory fanfare gets cut off by the fade-out. This final boss sequence, like Krematoa as a whole, quite frankly seems a little undercooked. Which is funny because once K. Rool's sub rises, the whole area and every level in it is covered in this red-hot filter. Boomer even gets a fan! But nothing else changes. Like, I get the impression they had something grander in mind for this, maybe remixing each level to build to a true final boss, but ran out of time and had to call it good enough. Speaking of undercooked, let's talk about the finale. Once you find all the banana birds, they take you to the Queen Banana Bird. And on the one hand, this kinda fits better than you'd think. The bananas themselves are derived from a deity. That's why they seem to be on the Kong side. That's why they point the way forward in level design. And that's why a bunch of Kremlings wanted them to begin with. I know that's definitely extrapolating between the lines again, but hey, that didn't stop Retro Studios from following up on it. But, taken as it is in this game, it's another aspect that's just a little too far out of left field to really land. The game isn't even subtextually about uncovering the mysteries or lore behind the bananas. It hasn't done anything to build up to this aside from just having banana birds. All of this paints a picture of DKC3 as a game that doesn't quite get off on the right foot, and doesn't quite stick the landing either. Maybe that's another reason it's not remembered as well as the others. It's the same thing that happened to me with The Lost World. Sequence bias means we remember the first and last things we experience in a game more than we remember the middle. And if we judge DKC3 on that, it would be very easy to see it as a lesser than. Of course, Donkey Kong Country 3 has a strong identity of its own, it just takes its time revealing itself. It's not nearly as direct as games typically were, especially back then. It's all a little more understated. And maybe that's why... you know what? Maybe the best way to say this is by way of comparison. Let's just see what I said 7 years ago. This story is evidence of two of the biggest problems with DKC3, theme and tone. Now certainly these environments and enemies are creatively designed, but there's not much that thematically ties them together. Yeah, there is. It's actually not far off from that understated environmentalism message that runs through those Sonic games you never shut up about. How cool would it have been if the Kremlings had been horrifying abominations of science, evidence of K. Rool's experiments gone awry? I mean, sure, have everything start out all bright and happy, but as you get deeper into the game, something's going horribly wrong here. That's exactly what's happening! Oh man, I was so close! You can tell I started to realize how wrong I was during the editing process. Because yeah, some of the enemies are mad scientist abominations of biology and technology, both complimenting and teasing the reveal of who exactly is behind all this. Buzzes are grafted with whirling razor blades where their stingers should be. Carbines and bazookas have been fitted with oversized weapons. Even your run-of-the-mill Kremlings are more misshapen and exaggerated than usual, as if someone, or something, has been running Frankenstein experiments to enhance their abilities. And yeah, sure, not every enemy carries this theme, but that is in line with the overarching theme, a juxtaposition between nature and a corrupting influence. As if this monstrosity wasn't enough of a hint. Yeah, I'm surprised that one didn't give me nightmares. Donkey Kong Island's two biggest heroes are gone, but it's played so lightly here that what should be a tremendous undertaking has all the apprehension of a Saturday morning cartoon. Now there's nothing wrong with comic relief villains or a lighthearted approach, but DKC2 made me feel things. DKC3 lacks that kind of pathos. No, it doesn't. Part of the reason DKC2 made me feel things was because of what it meant to me, and that's awesome. But just because DKC3 doesn't replicate that doesn't mean it lacks pathos. It just means I lacked the same degree of personal connection to it. It'd be one thing if I didn't think it was executed as well, or if what it was doing just wasn't as much to my tastes, but I know what I was doing in 2015, and I can't give myself the benefit of the doubt. I came into this project already knowing that I didn't like it as much as the first two games, and consciously or otherwise, I wanted to justify that opinion. I didn't give myself much incentive to approach the game with good faith. I hadn't even been making these videos for a year yet, but maybe I was getting cocky. I'd written almost the entire script before I'd actually gotten very far in the game. In fact, I made that a talking point in the video. Look, I'm this far into the script, and I still haven't even gotten close to the end of the game. That's never happened before. I would rather work than keep playing. Somehow I did not anticipate the problem with this. I had built my script, the entire foundation of the video, on the perspective that I'd walked away with when I was 8. When I went back, played the game, and thought about it critically 18 years later, lo and behold, my perspective had changed. A lot. That was the problem I couldn't identify in 2015. It wasn't in my script, it was in myself. I don't think I understood at the time that my perspective on a game was even open to change. Especially not one I was so familiar with, and especially not to that degree. Nowadays this happens so often that it's weird when it doesn't. Most of the time now, if I go back and play a game that I remember hating, or a game that I thought wasn't for me, I'll wind up finding something to like about it. I was always a glass-half-full guy anyway, but it's like after the last few years, I am more sick of cynicism than ever. The last thing I want to do when I play a game is focus on the negatives. But back then I was more sure of my opinions, more set in my ways, more narrow in my view of what I liked. I thought I knew my tastes, and I knew that my tastes were right. This is what video games are supposed to be, I'd claim. Not as a goofy joke, but like it was a hard fact. It's like I had spent so long being I'm still young that I hadn't noticed. But I'm not that young. I didn't know I even had or could have a more, for lack of a better term, grown-up perspective, and I didn't know how to articulate it. Because for all the grief I gave DKC3 for being too quote-unquote cartoony, the only explanation for how I could even come to some of those conclusions was that I cherry-picked the silliest moments and presented them, to myself and to my viewers, as representative of the entire game. Because sure, the moment where the curtain finally comes up to reveal that, gasp, K. Rool was behind this scheme the whole time, and he gets all lachrymose about how his wife, whom he's never mentioned before and never will again, is gonna kill him because he built chaos out of all of our best pots and pans. That's like something out of a cartoon. But K. Rool is a villain so over-the-top and ostentatious that he reinvents his persona with every game. The last game ended with him getting uppercut through the ceiling, tumbling down his own island, being eaten by sharks, and then showing up again and firing a bunch of fish out of his blunderbuss. This is exactly how you'd expect him to act. The only immature thing about this was me. Like, how dare something silly happen in a video game about talking monkeys? When you like a game, you're going to be more inclined to read it in the best light possible, to give it a more charitable reading than even the devs probably intended, to extrapolate between the lines, as I keep putting it. And that can be a lot of fun. But as much good faith as fans will offer the things they like, they'll be equally as ruthless with things they don't. Especially if it's some kind of a successor to something they liked better. Especially if it's based on a property that was important to them growing up. And obviously, analyzing a piece of media by comparing it to other media in the same series isn't invalid. I've done it a bunch here, but it's not the only valid lens to use. And fixating on all the negative connotations of such a comparison, to the near exclusion of anything else, well, I've come to see it as a pretty sure sign of bad criticism. I was being a bad critic when I made this video, because look at how much it just had to go unappreciated in service of that reading, that DKC3 is bad because it doesn't live up to what came before. Why, because it has more levity? I mean, Dixie isn't in enemy territory at the start, the stakes aren't as high, so why shouldn't it have more levity? But no, I saw only my criticisms. I blew them out of proportion by holding my fanboy adulation of the earlier game against this one, and I missed the bigger picture. I missed it so bad that I almost circled back around to it on accident. I failed to appreciate the Northern Hemisphere on anything deeper than a mechanical level. I didn't notice how tense, serious, stressful, and beautiful the game can be. Do I like it as much as DKC 1 and 2? Well, no. I think I'm being perfectly fair to say it's not as good as Diddy's Conquest, and while I can plainly see that it's probably a better game than the original, the first game's design philosophy just resonates with me more. Preferences are still preferences, and I still have mine. But in case I haven't made this clear, getting hung up on comparisons like this might just lead someone to miss the forest for the trees. And hey, the fact that it didn't do it for me the way the others did, at least means I haven't replayed it to the point that the game's every sequence is burned into my brain. Playing it now, it's a much fresher experience for me. In a way, I'm kinda glad it took me this long to come around on it. Donkey Kong Country 3 is the victim of bad timing and worse circumstances. The day it came out, it was already old. The Super Nintendo's third act may well have been its best, but the sun had all but set. The pantheon of games that came out before DKC3 runs deep and wide, but I can count the notable Super Nintendo releases that came out after this one on one hand. The legacy of Dixie's game is forever in the shadow of its predecessors. One, an era-defining game that turned the tide of the 16-bit war in Nintendo's favor. The other, one of the apex examples of its genre, but maybe that's why its defenders seem to be so passionate, insisting that it does earn its place in the trilogy, that it shouldn't have been forgotten, that it does stand on its own merits, that it really is so much more than just the other one. It took me a long time, but I can finally count myself among you. Donkey Kong Country 3 wasn't an anti-climax. It was the end of an era for Rare, for Nintendo, for everything the industry had been before. It was the last cadence of a grand finale.